To understand the sheer magnitude of the violence that has engulfed the Armageddon system in the 41st millennium, one must first understand the prize itself. Armageddon is not merely a battlefield, it is a furnace of industry, a linchpin of Imperial logistics, and a world so thoroughly weaponized that its very atmosphere tastes of promethium and spent propellant. It stands as one of the most vital hive worlds in the entire Imperium, a designation that fails to capture the sheer scale of its production capabilities. Located in the Armageddon sector within the Segmentum Solar, it sits uncomfortably close to the galactic core, and by extension, Terra itself. This proximity dictates its strategic value. Armageddon is the armory of the Segmentum Solar, pumping out billions of tons of munitions, millions of armored vehicles, and endless regiments of disciplined soldiers to fuel the Imperial Guard's endless wars. Losing Armageddon would not just be a morale blow, it would sever a main artery of supply for thousands of war zones, potentially causing the collapse of Imperial fronts across hundreds of light years. The planet's geography is a testament to the brutal efficiency of the Imperium, divided sharply into distinct zones that dictate the flow of life and war. The landmass is split into two primary continents, Armageddon Prime and Armageddon Secundus, separated by the thick, choked band of the equatorial jungle. Armageddon Prime, the northern continent, is the older of the two inhabited regions. It is a land of high, craggy plateaus and jagged mountain ranges that pierce the smog-choked sky. The hive cities here are ancient, their foundations sunk deep into the bedrock of the planet's crust. While Prime is less populous than its southern counterpart, it hosts critical infrastructure, including the immense hive Tempestora and hive Gemini. The terrain of Prime is unforgiving, characterized by rocky badlands and narrow passes that make large-scale vehicular movement difficult outside of the established transit highways. This geography forces invaders into predictable choke points, turning the mountains into natural fortresses where artillery can rain death upon stalled columns. To the south lies Armageddon Secundus, the industrial heart of the world and the primary objective for any invading force. Secundus is more populous, wealthier, and produces the lion's share of the planet's manufacturing output. The landscape here is flatter but no less hostile, dominated by the rolling dunes of the fire wastes and the ash wastes. These are vast deserts of gray dust, composed of millennia of industrial runoff, powdered rock, and chemical residue. The winds in Secundus can strip the flesh from a man's bones in hours if he is caught unprotected, and the ash clogs air intakes and weapon mechanisms with relentless persistence. Rising from these wastes are the titans of industry, Hive Infernus, Hive Hellsreach, and the tragic Hive Hades. These cities are mountains of steel and ferrocrete, housing billions of citizens who live their entire lives without seeing the sun, working in shifts that never end to feed the insatiable demand of the Adeptus Munitorum. The connectivity between these hives is maintained by massive superhighways and maglev trains, arteries of commerce that become the veins of war when the enemy lands. Separating these two continents is the equatorial jungle, a region that serves as a grim reminder that nature, even on a poisoned world, finds a way to be lethal. This is not a jungle of lush greenery and vibrant life, but a festering scar on the planet's surface. It is a sweltering, toxic morass where the runoff from the northern and southern hives collects. The trees are mutated giants with bark like iron, and the swamps are acidic sludge that can dissolve a flak jacket. The atmosphere within the jungle is heavy with spores and viral agents, requiring heavy filtration gear for any human to survive. It acts as a natural barrier between Prime and Secundus, impassable to heavy armor and hostile to aircraft due to the violent, unpredictable weather patterns generated by the heat exchange between the cooling wastes and the steaming jungle. Historically, this region was considered a no-man's land, but it has proven to be a festering breeding ground for orc spores, allowing the greenskins to regroup and multiply in the dark, festering heart of the world, hidden from orbital auspex scans by the dense canopy and atmospheric interference. Beyond the inhabited zones lie the fire wastes in the extreme north and south, regions of volcanic activity and unstable tectonics where the planet vents its internal fury. These areas are dotted with mining outposts and penal colonies, where the worst of Imperial society are sent to dig for the raw minerals that feed the hives. The conditions here are apocalyptic, with lava flows and ash storms that can bury entire facilities overnight. Yet even these hellscapes are fortified, for on Armageddon, there is no patch of ground that does not serve the Emperor's war machine. The sheer hostility of the environment means that war on Armageddon is fought as much against the planet as it is against the enemy. A commander who fails to account for the acid rain, the ash storms, or the toxic fog will find their army dead before a single shot is fired. However, the physical geography of Armageddon is only half of the story. The spiritual and historical geography is scarred by a conflict that the Imperium has tried, with ruthless efficiency, to erase from memory. This is the shadow of the First War for Armageddon. In the mid-41st millennium, roughly 500 years before the Ork invasions that would make the planet infamous, Armageddon was the site of a chaotic incursion led by the demon Primarch Angron of the World Eaters. The 12th Legion, supported by hordes of demons, descended upon the planet, turning the streets of Armageddon Prime into slaughterhouses. The local defense forces and the Space Wolves, led by Great Wolf Logan Grimnar, fought a desperate holding action, but the tide was only turned by the arrival of the Grey Knights, the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus. The victory against Angron came at a terrible cost. A brotherhood of Grey Knights teleported directly into the center of the demonic horde to banish the demon Primarch. The battle was catastrophic. Over 100 Grey Knights perished, their souls and bodies broken to drive the entity back into the warp. But the true horror began after the guns fell silent. The Inquisition determined that the population of Armageddon, having been exposed to the corrupting influence of chaos and the reality of demonic existence, could not be allowed to spread that taint. The existence of the Grey Knights and the fallen Primarchs are secrets the Imperium guards with genocide. The entire population of Armageddon, billions of faithful citizens who had fought and bled for their world, was sterilized and worked to death in labor camps or simply executed. The planet was repopulated with colonists from other worlds, who were brought in with no knowledge of the history of their new home. The soldiers of the Armageddon Steel Legion today are the descendants of these colonists, fighting on ground soaked in the blood of martyrs whose names were purged from the records. This dark history festers beneath the surface, a grim irony that the heroes of Armageddon are living on a graveyard of the innocent, killed not by the enemy, but by the very Imperium they served. Deep beneath this layer of erased history lies an even older, more dangerous truth, one known only to the highest echelons of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the inner circles of the Inquisition. Armageddon is not originally from this system. During the War of the Beast in the 32nd millennium, the planet was known as Ulaner. This was the capital of the greatest Ork empire ever encountered, the site of the triumph of Ulaner, where the Emperor named Horus as Warmaster. Following the defeat of the Beast, the Adeptus Mechanicus used colossal, forbidden gravity manipulation technology to physically transport the entire world of Ulaner to the Armageddon system to hide it, hoping to erase its location from the racial memory of the Ork species. They failed. The Orks do not need star charts. They possess a genetic instinct, a WAAAGH energy that draws them back to their places of power. The Greenskins come to Armageddon not just for the fight, but because their blood remembers that this rock was once the throne world of their greatest warlords. This secret identity explains the relentless obsession the Orks have with the world. It is a pilgrimage to a holy site of violence, calling to them across the stars. The defenders of this cursed and vital world are the Armageddon Steel Legion, widely recognized as one of the most effective mechanized infantry forces in the galaxy. Their doctrine is born of their environment. On the ash wastes of Armageddon, a soldier on foot is a dead soldier, either killed by the enemy or by the toxic winds. As a result, the Steel Legion is entirely mobile. Every squad is assigned a Chimera armored transport, and their tactics revolve around the Steel Wall, a coordinated advance of heavy armor supported by dismounting infantry who secure objectives and suppress enemy anti-tank teams. The soldiers themselves are easily identifiable by their ochre and mustard-colored greatcoats, treated with chemical sealants to repel acidic rain and industrial waste. Their faces are perpetually obscured by rebreather masks and skull-shaped helmets, giving them a dehumanized, grim visage that strikes fear into rebels and Xenos alike. The Steel Legion's recruitment pool is the teeming gangs of the Hive cities. In the underhives of Hades and Hellsreach, life is a brutal struggle for resources, and gang warfare is the status quo. The Imperial Guard Tithe taps into this violent reservoir, taking gang members who are already hardened killers and drilling them into disciplined soldiers. Unlike the feral gangs of Necromunda who might struggle with rigid authority, the Armageddon gangs are already accustomed to hierarchy and industrial structure. When they are given a lasgun and a uniform, they transfer their loyalty from their gang leader to their sergeant and the Emperor. They are experts in urban warfare and hive defense, knowing instinctively how to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of a manufactorum or how to set an ambush in a waste processing facility. Their weaponry reflects their mechanized focus. Many Steel Legion lasguns are manufactured with folding stocks to make them easier to handle within the cramped confines of a chimera. They also make extensive use of grenade launchers and missile launchers, weapons that provide the punch needed to crack open enemy bunkers or light vehicles in the dense terrain of a hive city. A key component of the Steel Legion's effectiveness is their seamless integration with the massive armored regiments produced on their homeworld. Armageddon manufactures the Leman Russ battle tank in quantities that stagger the imagination. The specific patterns produced here are ruggedized, featuring reinforced air filtration systems to prevent the engine from choking on ash. When the Steel Legion goes to war, they do not do so as a wave of flesh, but as a tide of iron. A typical engagement sees columns of Leman Russ tanks spearheading the assault, their battle cannons pulverizing enemy positions, while the chimeras of the infantry flank to protect the tank's sides and rear. Once the enemy line is broken, the infantry dismounts to clear the ruins, room by room, with lasfare and bayonets. This synergy between man and machine is what allows the Imperium to hold Armageddon against odds that would crush a lesser force. They are not just soldiers, they are the crew of a planetary-sized war engine. The strategic importance of Armageddon cannot be overstated, and it is this importance that makes it such an irresistible target. It sits at the nexus of several stable warp routes, making it a natural gathering point for fleets and armies. The sheer volume of material produced by its hives supplies the Imperial Guard regiments across the entire segmentum solar. If Armageddon falls, the ripple effect would cause ammunition shortages on 1,000 worlds. The tanks produced in Hive and Furnace are fighting on Cadia, on Ryza, and on the fringes of the Ghoul stars. The chimeras rolled off the assembly lines of Hive Hellsreach carry soldiers on planets the workers will never see. This industrial output makes the planet a jewel in the Emperor's crown, but it also paints a target on the world for every enemy of mankind. For the Orks, Armageddon is the ultimate challenge. It is a world made of war, producing weapons of war, defended by warriors who live for war. It is the perfect environment for a species that thrives on conflict. The distinct geography of the planet offers the Orks everything they desire: the dense cover of the equatorial jungle to breed and build, the open ash wastes for massive vehicular speed freak races and tank battles, and the vertical hellscapes of the hives for close-quarters slaughter. The planet itself seems designed to facilitate the kind of grinding, attrition-based warfare that the Greenskins adore. Furthermore, the planet's defenses are formidable but static. The planetary defense batteries, the orbital stations, and the void shield generators that protect the hives are ancient and powerful, but they are fixed in place. This forces the defenders into a reactive posture. The Imperial Guard must hold the walls, while the enemy has the freedom to choose where to strike. This dynamic was painfully evident during the wars that followed the first incursion. The vast distances between the hives on Secundus mean that if the connecting highways are cut, a hive can be besieged in isolation, cut off from reinforcement. The Steel Legion's mobility is the only counter to this, using their chimeras to redeploy rapidly across the wastes to plug gaps in the line. The atmosphere of the planet also plays a critical role in its strategic reality. The heavy pollution and constant cloud cover degrade the effectiveness of orbital bombardment and long-range communication. Void ships in orbit often struggle to pinpoint targets on the surface through the layers of smog and industrial haze. This forces the war to be decided on the ground, in the mud and the ash. It negates the Imperium's advantage of orbital supremacy to a degree, forcing the conflict into the range of bolters and choppas. This favors the orcs, who prefer to look their enemy in the eye as they kill them. In summary of the landscape and its history, Armageddon is a world of contradictions. It is a place of immense value that is also a toxic hellhole. It is a bastion of imperial strength built upon a foundation of erased history and genocide. It is the home of the Steel Legion, heroes of the Imperium, who are the descendants of imported colonists living on the graves of the true natives. It is a former orc throne world masquerading as an imperial industrial hub. Every tank that rolls off the assembly line, every lasgun power pack charged in the thermal vents, and every soldier that dons the ochre coat contributes to the defense of the segmentum solar, yet they also contribute to the beacon that draws the enemies of mankind to this cursed sector. The stage is set on this geography of ash and iron for a conflict of apocalyptic proportions, where the ghosts of the past, both the demonic and the xenos, wait in the shadows of the hives, hungry for the blood that is about to be spilled in oceans. The geography dictates the war, and on Armageddon, the geography is designed for death. While the forges of Armageddon churned out the weapons of the Imperium, unaware of the doom approaching, a singular entity was rising from the anarchy of a neighboring system to claim the title of the greatest orc warlord in the galaxy. The origins of the Second War for Armageddon did not begin on the ash wastes of the hive world itself, but in the Ork system, a place of negligible strategic value to the Administratum, but of immense significance to the greenskin race. Ork was a dying world, its sun bloated and unstable, bathing the planet in harsh, radioactive light that accelerated the aggressive biological cycles of the orcs inhabiting it. It was here that a lowly goth boy named Ghazghkull Thraka began his ascent. Ghazghkull was not born a leader. He began his existence as a simple foot soldier, indistinguishable from the millions of other boys fighting in the endless, internecine tribal wars that defined orc society. His destiny changed during a raid on a Space Marine command post. While the specific chapter involved remains a matter of conflicting reports, some citing the Dark Angels, others merely noting the presence of Astartes bolters, the result was undeniable. A bolter shell struck Ghazghkull in the head, devastating his skull and destroying a significant portion of his brain. By all biological logic, the orc should have died instantly. Instead, his ruined body was dragged to the surgery of the pain boy known as Mad Doc Grotznik. Grotznik, a practitioner of medicine whose methods were considered insane even by orc standards, saw an opportunity for experimentation rather than salvation. He replaced the missing portion of Ghazghkull's cranium with a crude, riveted dome of adamantium bionics, rewiring the neural pathways with chaotic ingenuity. When Ghazghkull awoke from the anesthesia of concussion and fungal brew, he was changed. The bionic implant pulsed with a latent energy, and the warlord claimed that he could hear the voices of the orc gods, Gork and Mork, speaking directly to him. They did not speak of random violence, but of a grand design, a mission to unite the scattered tribes and lead them on the greatest WAAAGH the galaxy had ever seen. This claim of divine purpose was backed by a terrifying increase in physical size and strength, a side effect of the trauma and the bionics stimulating the unique orc physiology. Ghazghkull quickly brutalized his way to the top of the Goth hierarchy on Ork. He did not merely defeat his rivals, he absorbed their mobs, displaying a tactical acumen that was frighteningly un-orky. He stopped the tribes from killing each other and turned their aggression toward the task of leaving the planet. The voices in his head grew louder, warning him that Ork was about to die. Under his iron-fisted direction, the orcs of Ork ceased their infighting and began a frantic construction effort, enslaving the planet's remaining resources. As the star of the Ork system began its final spasms towards a supernova event, a colossal space hulk drifted into the system, drawn by the unpredictable currents of the warp. To Ghazghkull, this was not a coincidence. It was the chariot of the gods, sent to carry his army to their destiny. The Hulk, a massive conglomeration of fused starships, asteroids, and debris accumulated over thousands of years, was seized by the unified tribes. They named it the Space Hulk, a simple designation for a vessel of world-killing magnitude, and boarded it by the millions just as Ork was consumed by the fires of its dying sun. The prophet of the WAAAGH had saved his people, confirming his status as the chosen one of Gork and Mork. The first ripples of this gathering storm reached the Imperium in the year 940, one of the 41st millennium. The Armageddon system, sitting at a critical junction of warp routes, relied on a network of deep space monitoring stations to provide early warning of incursions. The most distant of these was the Alighieri, a lonely outpost manned by Adeptus Astra Telepathica personnel and Auspex servitors, located on the very edge of the system's Manville point. The crew of the Alighieri were the first human eyes to witness the scale of the threat. Their long-range augers detected a massive gravitational distortion tearing through the fabric of real space, a signature so large that the cogitators initially dismissed it as a sensor malfunction or a stellar phenomenon. When the anomaly solidified, it resolved into a physical object of impossible proportions. The space hulk carrying Ghazghkulls was not merely a ship, it was a moon-sized artificial planetoid, bristling with crude weaponry and trailing a wake of smaller attack craft and escort cruisers like a swarm of flies around a rotting carcass. The sheer mass of the object disrupted the gravitational equilibrium of the outer system. The Alighieri transmitted a frantic data packet back to Armageddon Prime, detailing the size and trajectory of the intruder. Moments later, the signal from the station was abruptly cut. There was no static, no distress call, merely immediate and total silence, indicating that the station had been overrun or vaporized in the opening seconds of the Hulk's arrival. The data packet arrived at Hive Tartarus, the seat of planetary government, where it was delivered to the ruling council. At the head of this council sat Overlord Hermann von Straub, the planetary governor of Armageddon. Von Straub was a man who personified the decay of the imperial nobility. Descended from a long line of governors, he viewed Armageddon not as a charge to be protected, but as a personal fiefdom that existed to serve his desires. He was a creature of immense vanity and arrogance, draped in silks and velvets that cost more than the lifetime earnings of a hive worker, ruling from a palace that floated above the smog layer, detached from the grim reality of the world below. When the warning from the Alighieri was presented to him, von Straub dismissed it with a wave of his hand. His hubris was built on a foundation of willful ignorance and a deep-seated disdain for the Imperium's military bureaucracy. He viewed the warnings of Xeno's incursions as alarmist propaganda designed to justify the presence of the Imperial Guard and undermine his authority. The governor argued that the warp storms surrounding the Armageddon sector were impassable to such a massive fleet, and that the signal was likely a glitched echo or a minor pirate raid that the planetary defense monitors could easily handle. This delusion was challenged by only one man, Commissar Sebastian Yarrick. At the time, Yarrick was attached to the 4th Armageddon Steel Legion, a regiment renowned for its discipline. Yarrick was already a veteran of countless campaigns, a man who understood the psychology of the Ork better than perhaps any living human. He recognized the patterns in the interference, the silence of the Alighieri, and the specific nature of the threat. He bypassed the chain of command to confront von Straub directly, demanding that the planetary defense network be brought to full alert and that an astropathic distress signal be sent immediately to the Segmentum Command to request Adeptus Astartes' assistance. The confrontation between Yarrick and von Straub was the pivot point upon which the fate of the sector turned. Von Straub, incensed that a mere commissar would dare to give him orders in his own court, accused Yarrick of inciting panic and undermining morale. The governor's paranoia led him to believe that Yarrick was an agent of the Adeptus Munitorum sent to strip him of his power. In a fit of pique, von Straub ordered the astropaths to remain silent, forbidding any messages from leaving the system under penalty of death. He declared that Armageddon possessed sufficient might to crush any invader, and that he would not have his reputation tarnished by crying for help at the first sign of a shadow on the Auspex. To remove the thorn from his side, von Straub exiled Commissar Yarrick to Hive Hades. Located in the southern hemisphere on Armageddon Secundus, Hades was a major industrial center, but was considered strategically secondary to the command hubs on Prime. By sending Yarrick there to oversee the local PDF logistics, von Straub believed he was burying the commissar in paperwork and obscurity. It was a miscalculation of catastrophic proportions. Von Straub had inadvertently placed the Imperium's most capable commander in charge of the Hive that would become the linchpin of the resistance. While the governor dined in his floating palace, and his sycophants assured him of the impregnability of the system, the green tide crashed against the shores of Armageddon. The space hulk, ignoring the standard engagement ranges, barreled directly toward the planet. The system defense ships, ancient monitors armed with macro cannons and lance batteries, moved to intercept. They were hopelessly outmatched. The Ork fleet did not engage in a duel of maneuver. They simply plowed through the Imperial formation. The defense monitors were torn apart by the sheer volume of fire from the Hulk's erratic but devastating weapon batteries, or were boarded by torpedoes filled with thousands of Ork boys who slaughtered the crews in the corridors. In late 941, the invasion of the surface began. The Orks did not utilize organized drop zones or careful orbital insertions. They utilized rocks, hollowed-out asteroids fitted with retro thrusters and force fields. These massive projectiles were hurled from the space hulk at the planet below. They slammed into the atmosphere of Armageddon, burning like meteors, before smashing into the surface with the force of tactical nuclear weapons. The impacts threw up clouds of ash and debris that choked the already polluted sky, turning day into a permanent, bruised twilight. The primary bombardment targeted Armageddon Prime, the western continent. The logic of the Ork attack, driven by Ghazghkull's cunning, was to secure a foothold in the mountainous, defensible terrain of Prime before pushing south. The rocks smashed into the communication arrays and defense silos of the western hives. From the craters of these impacts, the doors of the rocks fell open and the WAAAGH poured forth. It was a scene of primal horror. Millions of greenskins, clad in scrap armor and wielding choppas and sluggas, surged into the Badlands. They were supported by gargants, towering effigies of their gods that walked with a lumbering, destructive gait, and endless columns of battle wagons that belched black smoke into the air. The planetary defense forces stationed on Armageddon Prime were caught completely unprepared. Due to von Straub's refusal to mobilize, many regiments were still in their barracks or manning peacetime checkpoints when the rocks landed. The initial engagements were massacres. Isolated PDF outposts were overrun in minutes, their last fire ineffective against the sheer mass of the Ork wave. The speed of the invasion was unlike anything the defenders had trained for. Ghazghkull's influence was evident in the discipline of the assault. The Orks did not stop to loot or celebrate every minor victory. They pushed forward relentlessly, driving deep into the heart of the continent. Within days, the defensive lines of Armageddon Prime began to disintegrate. The hive cities of Tempestora and Gemini were besieged. The mountain passes, which should have been kill zones for the Imperial artillery, became highways for the Ork heavy armor. The Steel Legion regiments on Prime fought with desperate courage, their chimeras forming mobile firing lines to stem the tide, but they were outnumbered hundreds to one. The command structure fractured as comms towers were toppled by Ork commandos or destroyed by Weirdboy psychic storms. Von Straub's reaction to the invasion of Prime was a mixture of denial and incompetence. Even as reports flooded in of hives falling silent and entire regiments being wiped out, he refused to release the full reserves of the planetary arsenal. He held back the Titan legions stationed on the planet, the Legio Metallica, fearing that deploying them would signal a loss of control. He attempted to micromanage the war from his palace, issuing orders that were hours out of date or tactically suicidal. He ordered light infantry to charge fortified Ork positions and forbade commanders from retreating to more defensible lines, declaring that not a single inch of Armageddon soil was to be yielded. This rigidity doomed the defenders of Prime. A fluid defense might have bought time, trading space for attrition, but the stand and die orders of the Overlord simply fed the Imperial Guard into the meat grinder. By the time the reality of the situation penetrated the haze of von Straub's arrogance, the western continent was effectively lost. The Orks had established a firm dominance over Armageddon Prime, turning the captured manufactorums into workshops to repair their war machines and looting the supply depots to feed their armies. The survivors of the PDF and Steel Legion retreated across the equatorial jungle, a chaotic withdrawal through the toxic swamps, harried all the way by Ork speed freaks. The invasion had succeeded with terrifying speed. Ghazghkull Thraka had landed his force, secured a continent, and broken the back of the planetary defenses in a matter of weeks. The The minor raid von Straub had dismissed was revealed to be a planetary extinction event. As the green tide consolidated its hold on the north, the burning eyes of the warlord turned south, toward the rich industrial heartland of Armageddon Secundus and the defiant hive of Hades, where a lone commissar was preparing to prove that faith and steel could withstand even the apocalypse. The prelude was over. The war for Armageddon had truly begun. The bombardment that heralded the death of Armageddon Prime was not merely an act of destruction. It was a masterclass in aggressive planetary assault that shattered the tactical dogmas of the Imperial strategists. As the rocks slammed into the crust of the northern continent, they did not just obliterate the landscape, they reshaped the battlefield to suit the invaders. Each impact crater became an instant beachhead, the hollowed-out asteroids cracking open to disgorge streams of heavy armor and infantry directly into the heart of the planet's defensive grid. The systematic dismantling of Imperial resistance on Armageddon Prime was swift, brutal, and terrifyingly coordinated, revealing that the beast commanding this WAAAGH was no ordinary savage. Ghazghkull Thraka had identified the fatal flaw in the defense of Prime, its reliance on rigid communication lines and static fortifications. The hive cities of Tempestora and Gemini were designed to withstand sieges from known vectors, with overlapping fields of fire covering the major highways and passes. They were not designed to fight an enemy that dropped from the sky directly between their supply lines. The Orks bypassed the strongest fortifications entirely. Mob after mob of evil Sunt's speed freaks roared out of the impact zones, their engines screaming as they tore across the rocky badlands. They severed the maglev lines and destroyed the promethium pipelines connecting the hives, plunging the cities into darkness and silence before the main assault even began. The planetary defense forces found themselves fighting in isolation. A regiment would report contact with a probing force of Ork buggies, only to be overrun an hour later by a tide of battle wagons and knobs. The command structure on Prime dissolved into chaos. Reports of green giants and walking mountains were dismissed by the upper echelons as hysteria, but on the ground the reality was undeniable. Ghazghkull did not pause to loot or celebrate. He drove his forces with a maniacal focus, pushing them to secure the mountain passes that led to the hives. Whenever a PDF line held, the warlord deployed his elite meganobs or called down pinpoint bombardments from the orbiting Hulk, displaying a grasp of combined arms warfare that the Imperium had never associated with greenskins. Within weeks, the northern continent was not just occupied, it was owned. The hives were sealed tight, their populations trapped inside as the Orks turned the surrounding industrial zones into vast scrap yards to fuel their war engine. While the north burned, the architect of Armageddon's doom sat in the governor's palace, weaving a tapestry of denial that would cost millions of lives. Overlord Hermann von Straub refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. Even as Hive Tempestora ceased transmitting, he publicly declared that the disturbances were the result of civil unrest and localized mutant uprisings. However, as the undeniable reality of the invasion pressed in, von Straub's delusion shifted from denial to a catastrophic arrogance. He believed that he alone possessed the strategic brilliance to crush the invaders, and he viewed the assistance of the wider Imperium as an insult to his heritage. To prove his superiority, von Straub ordered the deployment of his most potent reserve, the Titan Princeps of the Legio Metallica and the Skitarii legions of the Adeptus Mechanicus stationed on Armageddon. These were god machines and cybernetic warriors of the highest order, forces that could have held the line if deployed in a consolidated defensive wall supported by the Imperial Guard. Instead, von Straub ordered them to take the offensive. He commanded the Princeps to march their warlord and Reaver Titans directly into the chaotic badlands of Prime to hunt down the Ork rocks and scatter the rebels. The deployment was a tactical atrocity. The Titans of Legio Metallica, designed to dominate open battlefields with long-range firepower, were sent into the jagged, narrow canyons of the northern mountain ranges. They were separated from their infantry support as the Skitarii transport struggled to keep pace with the striding god machines over the broken terrain. This piecemeal commitment played directly into Ghazghkull's hands. The Orks did not meet the Titans in an open duel. They waited. As the Legio Metallica advanced deep into the trap, the canyon walls erupted. The orcs had concealed their own titans, the colossal gargants, amidst the rocky spires and industrial debris. These effigies of Gork and Mork were crude, smoke-belching monstrosities of scrap iron and rivets, but they were devastatingly effective. Mega gargants, their bellies filled with heavy ordnance, stepped out from behind the cover of the cliffs at point-blank range. The Imperial Titans found their void shields stripped away in seconds by the sheer volume of fire. The tragedy of the Iron Skulls was absolute. Warlord Titans, ancient machines housing machine spirits that had served the Emperor for millennia, were brought low by gravity manipulating tractor cannons that dragged them to their knees, exposing their reactor casings to the chopping blades of orc walkers. The Skitarii, arriving too late to screen the Titans, were engulfed by a green sea. The disciplined volleys of galvanic rifles scythed down hundreds of orcs, but the tech guard were simply drowned in bodies. Von Strab's folly resulted in the near-total destruction of the Legio Metallica's active strength on Armageddon, throwing away the planet's heaviest assets for zero strategic gain. The burning wrecks of the god machines were left to rust in the canyons, looted by mechboys who repurposed their sacred weaponry for their own abominable creations. With the northern continent effectively pacified and the heavy armor of the defenders crippled, the war entered a deceptive lull. The survivors of the Imperial forces on Prime had largely retreated south, crossing the natural barrier of the planet, the equatorial jungle. This dense band of toxic vegetation and acidic swamps separated Prime from the populous industrial heartland of Secundus. To the strategists in Hive Tartarus and Hive Deathmire, the jungle was an impassable wall. The foliage was so thick that it blocked Auspex scans, and the ground was a morass that would swallow a Leman Russ tank to its turret. The conventional wisdom held that no mechanized force could traverse it. Von Strab, confident in this geographic certainty, redeployed the bulk of his remaining forces to the coastlines and the highways, leaving the jungle border lightly guarded by picket lines. He had forgotten that orcs do not care for conventional wisdom. Ghazghkull looked at the jungle not as a barrier, but as a challenge. Under his orders, the WAAAGH transformed into a massive industrial excavation crew. Millions of Gretchen and orc boys, equipped with massive buzz saws and flamers, began to hack a path through the biological nightmare. They did not navigate the jungle, they murdered it. Behind the cutters came the mech boys, driving colossal, jury-rigged dozers that flattened the vegetation and laid down rough tracks of crushed rock and metal plates. The jungle crossing was a feat of engineering that no human mind would have attempted. The orcs worked with indefatigable energy, driven by the WAAAGH field. They ignored the casualties caused by the predatory flora, the venomous insects, and the acidic mists. If a truck sank into the swamp, they simply drove 2 more trucks over it, using the wreck as a foundation. In the steaming darkness beneath the canopy, the orcs built a highway of war, hidden from the eyes of the high-altitude surveillance jets by the thick, spore-choked clouds that hung over the equator. For weeks, the defenders of Armageddon Secundus waited for an attack from the air or the sea, unaware that a mechanized avalanche was grinding its way toward them through the trees. The silence of the jungle was deceptive. It masked the roar of thousands of engines and the tramping of millions of boots. When the orcs finally broke cover, the surprise was total. The breakout occurred along the banks of the Hemlock River. This waterway ran parallel to the southern edge of the jungle, serving as the final geographic demarcation between the wilderness and the civilized ash wastes of Secundus. The defense of this sector had been entrusted to elements of the Armageddon Steel Legion, specifically the regiments tasked with patrolling the quiet zones. The soldiers here were digging latrines and maintaining their chimeras, expecting a rotation to the front lines in the north, not realizing the front line was about to crash into them. It began with a trembling in the earth, a rhythmic vibration that rippled the oily surface of the river. Then, the jungle edge simply disintegrated. Trees that had stood for centuries were flattened as hundreds of orc battle wagons burst from the foliage in a line stretching for kilometers. The roar of WAAAGH drowned out the klaxons of the Imperial sentries. The orcs did not stop at the water's edge. Their vehicles were fitted with crude snorkels and sealed with tar. They plunged into the Hemlock River, driving across the riverbed or floating on pontoons made of empty fuel drums. The defense of the Hemlock River was a desperate, chaotic affair. The The Steel Legion commanders, realizing the magnitude of the intelligence failure, tried to form a firing line. Leman Russ battle tanks revved their engines, slewing their turrets to fire into the mass of crossing vehicles. Heavy bolters chattered, churning the river water into a bloody froth. For a brief moment, the discipline of the Steel Legion held the tide. Law's fire, disciplined by years of drill, volleyed into the oncoming greenskins, and high explosive shells shattered the leading Ork buggies. But the volume of the assault was overwhelming. For every battle wagon destroyed in the river, 3 more reached the southern bank. Ork stormboys strapped with unstable rockets leaped across the water, landing directly in the Imperial trenches to engage the guardsmen in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The defensive line, stretched thin and lacking heavy artillery support due to von Strab's misallocation of resources, began to buckle. The fighting at the Hemlock was vicious. Steel Legionnaires used their chimeras as mobile bunkers, reversing slowly while pouring fire into the advancing horde. Commissars stalked the lines, executing cowards and rallying the breaking squads, but courage alone could not stop the momentum of the crossing. The Orks established bridgeheads on the south bank, and within hours, the heavy gargants that had decimated the Legio Metallica on Prime began to wade across the river, their massive feet crushing the defensive earthworks. The collapse of the Hemlock River defensive line sent a shockwave of panic through the southern continent. A tremor felt more acutely in the strategic cogitators of the Imperial Guard than in the bedrock of the planet itself. While the rooted elements of the Steel Legion conducted fighting retreats across the ash wastes, trading kilometers for minutes, the green tide of Ghazghkull Thraka surged toward the prize that had been denied to them in the north, the hive cities of Armageddon Secundus. Among these, Hive Hades stood as a grim monolith of industrial output, a mountain of plasteel and ferrocrete rising from the gray desolation. It was here, in this perceived backwater of administrative exile, that the true war for the soul of Armageddon would be fought. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick watched the Auspex displays in the command sanctum of Hades' hive, his face illuminated by the harsh green glow of the tactical hololiths. The situation was mathematically hopeless. The planetary governor, Hermann von Strab, had effectively abandoned Hades, pulling the bulk of the remaining planetary reserves to protect his own seat of power at Hive Tartarus and the wealthier Hive Infernus. Hades was deemed a sacrificial pawn, a speed bump intended to slow the Ork advance by a fraction of a standard day. Yarrick, however, did not recognize the authority of defeat. Where von Strab saw a lost cause, Yarrick saw a fortress that could become an anvil upon which the WAAAGH would be broken. Yarrick's assumption of command was not granted by official decree, but seized through the sheer force of his presence. The local planetary defense force commanders, paralyzed by the conflicting orders from von Strab and the terrifying reality of the approaching horde, were on the verge of collapse. Yarrick stepped into this vacuum of leadership with the cold precision of a bolt pistol. He did not ask for loyalty, he demanded obedience to the Emperor. He executed the most hesitant of the high-ranking officers for cowardice in the face of the enemy, a summary judgment carried out in full view of the command staff, and immediately promoted junior officers who had shown initiative in the early skirmishes. This brutal reorganization stripped away the nepotism and incompetence that plagued the upper echelons of the Armageddon military hierarchy, leaving a command structure that was lean, terrified, and entirely focused on survival. The preparation of Hades' hive for the coming siege was a feat of logistical alchemy. Yarrick ordered the hive's massive industrial capacity to be turned inward. Manufactorums that once produced tractor parts or sheet metal were retooled within days to produce tank traps, flak armor, and millions of rounds of solid slug ammunition. The civilian population, usually regarded as mere labor fodder, was conscripted en masse. There were no non-combatants in Yarrick's Hades. Men, women, and children were organized into work gangs to dig trench lines in the ash wastes surrounding the hive, weld ferrocrete reinforcing plates over the lower habitation levels, and lay minefields that stretched for kilometers in every direction. The commissar understood that a hive city was a vertical labyrinth, a three-dimensional kill box waiting to be utilized. He ordered the lower levels flooded with promethium and rigged with explosives, preparing to turn the foundations of the city into a furnace should the outer walls be breached. When the vanguard of the Ork force arrived, They did not find a terrified populace waiting to be slaughtered. They found a fortress bristling with hate. The initial Ork assault was a disorganized rush of speed freaks and light vehicles, expecting to ride through the streets in a victory lap. Instead, they were met by a wall of synchronized heavy bolter fire and earthshaker artillery, barrages that Warraagh had pre-registered on every approach vector. The burning wrecks of Ork buggies and trucks piled up against the outer defense lines, creating a twisted metal berm that forced the following waves into narrow choke points. It was during these opening weeks of the siege that Warraagh began to weaponize the psychology of the enemy. He was a scholar of the greenskin mind, a man who had studied their language and their barbarous culture not out of curiosity, but out of a need to understand how to kill them more efficiently. He knew that orcs were a psychic race, their reality shaped by their collective belief, the WAAAGH energy. If enough orcs believed something to be true, the latent psychic resonance of the species could manifest that truth in reality. Warraagh decided to become their nightmare. He positioned himself constantly on the front lines, a stark figure in a black greatcoat and commissarial cap, standing amidst the grime and blood of the trenches. He refused to sleep for more than an hour at a time, fueled by combat stims and unyielding will. To the orcs observing the battle through their crude optics, it appeared that the human commander was everywhere at once. He was on the north wall repelling a Stormboy assault. Minutes later, he was reported leading a counter-charge in the southern loading docks. The rumors began to percolate through the orc ranks, carried by the Weird Boys and the Run-Thirds. The human boss was not a normal Humie. He was a dark spirit, a demon of the Emperor who could not be killed. Warraagh leaned into this mythos with calculated theatricality. He adopted the use of a storm bolter, a weapon typically mounted on vehicles or wielded by the transhuman space marines in Terminator armor. The recoil of such a weapon would shatter the arm of a normal man, but Warraagh had the weapon modified with a suspensor harness and recoil dampeners, allowing him to fire it one-handed. The deafening roar of the twin-linked bolter became a signature of his presence. When the orcs heard the distinct thundering bark of the weapon, they knew the old man was coming. He did not fire from cover. He stood atop the ramparts, silhouetted against the burning sky, firing bursts into the green mass, challenging them to strike him down. The most potent element of this psychological warfare was the legend of the evil eye. During the relentless defense, Warraagh lost an eye to a stray piece of shrapnel or a close-quarters engagement. Accounts vary in the chaos of the siege, but he refused to retire from the field. He continued to command with a bloody bandage wrapped around his head. The orcs, seeing him survive wounds that would fell an Angron, began to believe that he possessed the evil eye, a gaze that could kill a greenskin instantly. Warraagh, understanding the power of this belief, had his chirurgeons implant a crude, terrifying bionic eye that pulsed with a red laser sight. He did not hide the bionic. He removed the bandage and let the red light sweep across the battlefield. When the red gaze fell upon an orc mob, the greenskins would often hesitate, their primitive superstition overriding their battle lust, believing that to be looked upon by Warraagh was to be marked for death. This hesitation bought the defenders crucial seconds to reload and regroup. The strategic consequence of the resistance at Hades was profound. Ghazghkull Thraka, initially intent on a swift conquest of the planet to prove his supremacy to Gork and Mork, found himself fixated on the defiant hive. The warlord's psychology was simple. He sought the best fight. Infernus and Tartarus were strategically valuable, but the resistance there was commanded by nobles and cowards. Hades was where the fight was. It was where the hardest Humie lived. Consequently, Ghazghkull began to divert more and more of his WAAAGH toward Hades. Columns of battle wagons and gargants that should have been smashing the defenses of Tartarus were instead turning their guns toward Warraagh's walls. This turned the siege of Hades into a brutal battle of attrition that bled the Ork WAAAGH. For months, the defenders held. The streets of the hive became slaughterhouses. The orcs would breach a gate, only to find themselves trapped in a kill zone courtyard, surrounded by multi-laser turrets and chimera transports hull down in rubble. The fighting moved into the sewers, the ventilation shafts, and the manufactorum floors. Steel legionnaires fought with bayonets and entrenching tools when their power packs ran dry. The air in the hive became toxic with the smoke of propellant and the stench of decaying Xenos bodies, yet the line held. Every day Hades stood was a day that the rest of Armageddon Secundus was spared the full fury of the invasion. Warraagh had turned himself into the ultimate distraction, drawing the eye of the beast so that the rest of the planet might survive. However, attrition is a game that favors the side with the limitless numbers, and the orcs were nothing if not limitless. The supplies in Hades began to dwindle. The water recyclers were smashed by commando raids, and the ammunition stockpiles reached critical lows. The perimeter began to shrink. The outer districts were abandoned, rigged to explode as the defenders pulled back to the primary hive spire. The siege lines tightened like a noose. The sky above Hades was so thick with Ork fighter bombers that the sun was blotted out entirely, replaced by the amber glow of burning city blocks. The breaking point arrived not with a whimper, but with a cataclysmic assault led by Ghazghkull himself. Frustrated by the stalemate, the warlord committed his personal guard, the Goths, and his massive gargants to a final, all-out push. The sheer weight of the attack shattered the main gates of the hive spire. A tide of green flesh poured into the Grand Plaza, led by Warboss Ugglehard, one of Ghazghkull's most brutal lieutenants. The Imperial line buckled. It was in this moment of collapse that the legend of Warraagh was cemented in blood. As the orcs surged into the breach, Warraagh led a counter-charge, not to win the battle, but to buy time for the evacuation of the remaining civilians and specialized personnel. In the swirling melee, Warraagh found himself face-to-face with Warboss Ugglehard. The orc was a towering monstrosity of muscle and scrap iron armor, wielding a massive power claw that crackled with disruptive energy. The duel was brief and brutal. Ugglehard swung the claw, shearing through Warraagh's right arm at the elbow. The limb, along with his storm bolter, fell to the blood-slicked ferrocrete. By all rights, the commissar should have gone into shock and died. But Sebastian Warraagh was no longer just a man. He was a vessel of pure, unadulterated hatred for the Xenos. Adrenaline and sheer spite kept him upright. As the warboss roared in triumph, expecting the human to fall, Warraagh swung his chainsword with his remaining left hand. The blade roared, biting deep into the orc's neck, severing the jugular and the spinal column in a spray of dark, fungal blood. The warboss collapsed, and a stunned silence rippled through the immediate combatants. The orc stared in disbelief. The human had lost an arm and simply killed the victor. Warraagh did not fall. He stood over the corpse of the warboss, his cauterized stump smoking, and glared at the horde with his bionic eye. The sight of their leader slain by a maimed human broke the momentum of the orc assault in that sector. It was not a victory. The hive was lost, but it was a reprieve. The delay caused by the duel allowed the surviving Steel Legion forces to execute a breakout. They blasted their way through the thinnest section of the orc lines, a suicidal convoy of battered chimeras and commandeered civilian haulers racing into the ash wastes. Hades' hive fell, its spires toppling and its population enslaved or butchered, but the strategic victory belonged to the Imperium. The months bought by Warraagh's defiance had allowed the Space Marines of the Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and Salamanders to arrive in the system. The breakout force, carrying the unconscious and critically wounded Warraagh, linked up with the relief fleet. The story of the old man who refused to die, who cut down a warboss with one arm, spread like wildfire across the planet. To the Imperial Guard, he was the savior of Hades. To the orcs, he was Old Baal Eye, the boogeyman who would haunt their dreams. The hive was gone, but the symbol remained, and on a world like Armageddon, symbols were more powerful than macro cannons. While Warraagh was being rushed to the Medicae decks of a circling cruiser, the war on the ground shifted gears. The arrival of the Adeptus Astartes changed the equation entirely. No longer was this a desperate holding action by the Imperial Guard. It was now a war of extermination. The Space Marines did not deploy to hold walls, they deployed to sever heads. The Blood Angels, led by Commander Dante, prepared for a drop-pod assault directly into the heart of the Orc lines, aiming to do what the Titan legions and the planetary defenses had failed to do: strike at the command structure of the Ghazghkull, having finally conquered Hades, found his victory tasting of ash. He had taken the city, but he had lost time. The Humi reinforcements were making planetfall, and the great game of war was escalating to a level that even he had not anticipated. The warlord turned his gaze from the ruins of Hades to the incoming drop pods streaking through the atmosphere like meteors. The ground war for Armageddon was entering its final, most brutal phase, where the angels of death would descend to wrestle the world from the brink of oblivion. The defiance of Hades had set the stage. Now, the sons of the Primarchs would take the stage. The evacuation of the critically wounded Commissar Yarrick from the ruins of Hades Hive coincided with a shift in the celestial sphere of Armageddon that would alter the trajectory of the war. For months, the orbital space had been a chaotic killing ground dominated by the crude, erratic warships of the Ork fleet. The Imperial Navy squadrons, outnumbered and outgunned by the sheer mass of the Space Hulk and its escorting kill cruisers, had been forced to the system's periphery, engaging in hit-and-run attacks that did little to stem the flow of reinforcements to the surface. The void belonged to the Greenskins, allowing them to rain debris and destruction upon the planet with impunity. This dominance ended with the sudden, violent translation of 3 distinct fleets from the warp, tearing through the immaterium at the Manville Point with the precision of a scalpel. The distress calls sent by Yarrick and the few loyalist commanders who had bypassed von Strab's communications blackout had not fallen on deaf ears. The response was overwhelming, a gathering of might that represented the finest warriors humanity could muster. Leading the vanguard were the Blood Angels, their battle barges and strike cruisers painted in the deep crimson of arterial blood, adorned with the golden iconography of the angel. Flanking them were the heavy, industrial-looking vessels of the Salamanders, their hulls reinforced to withstand the volcanic pressures of their homeworld Nocturne, and the pristine, regal warships of the Ultramarines, the exemplars of the Codex Astartes. This was not merely a reinforcement fleet, it was an extermination force. The arrival of the Adeptus Astartes changed the calculus of the Void War instantly. The Space Marine vessels did not engage in the long-range duels favored by the Imperial Navy. They drove straight into the heart of the Ork blockade, their void shields flaring under the bombardment of solid projectile macro cannons. Boarding torpedoes and Thunderhawk gunships launched in swarms, carrying squads of Terminators and tactical Marines directly onto the decks of the Ork cruisers. The discipline of the Astartes fleets, coordinating their fire patterns to overload the unstable power fields of the Ork ships, shattered the blockade in a matter of hours. The sky above Armageddon Secundus, previously choked with the contrails of Ork dropships, was suddenly streaked with the fiery entry trails of thousands of drop pods. While the drop pods screamed through the atmosphere, a political drama of equal ferocity was playing out within the grand spire of Hive Tartarus. Overlord Hermann von Strab, increasingly isolated in his delusion, watched the arrival of the Space Marines not with relief, but with paranoia. He viewed their intervention as a direct challenge to his authority, a censure from the High Lords of Terra that would strip him of his hereditary rights. When the Thunderhawks of the Chapter Masters touched down on the private landing pads of the Governor's Palace, von Strab ordered his household guard to bar their entry, a command that displayed a profound misunderstanding of who exactly was knocking at his door. The household guard, clad in ceremonial armor and wielding lasguns designed more for parade than combat, found themselves facing the giants of legend. At the head of the delegation strode Commander Dante of the Blood Angels. Dante was a figure of awe, the oldest living space marine outside of a dreadnought sarcophagus, a warrior who had led the sons of Sanguinius for over 1,000 years. Clad in golden artificer armor that sculpted his physique into that of a demigod, and wearing the death mask of Sanguinius, which froze the Primarch's features in a rictus of noble fury, Dante radiated an aura of command that silenced the room before he spoke a word. Beside him walked Marnius Calgar of the Ultramarines and Tushan of the Salamanders, a massive warrior whose cloak was fashioned from the hide of a fire drake and whose helm was marked with the honor scars of his chapter. Von Strab attempted to assert his dominance, screeching about his planetary rights and the violation of his airspace. He demanded that the Astartes place themselves under his direct command and follow his strategy of static defense. Dante did not shout, he did not threaten. He simply informed the Overlord that his command was terminated. The Blood Angels chapter master, by virtue of his seniority and the reverence in which he was held by all chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, assumed supreme command of the Armageddon theater. The shift was absolute. When von Strab attempted to order his guards to arrest the Space Marines, the soldiers dropped their weapons, recognizing that their loyalty to the Emperor superseded their loyalty to a failing governor. The deposition of von Strab was swift. He was not executed on the spot. The Astartes were bound by the complex laws of the Imperium regarding the high nobility, but he was placed under house arrest, stripped of his titles, and charged with gross negligence and heresy for his failure to signal the Imperium of the Xenos threat. The administration of the planet was effectively dissolved and replaced by a war council headed by Dante. The defense of Armageddon was no longer a planetary police action. It was now a crusade. The resources of the entire world, which von Straub had hoarded or squandered, were instantly seized by the Astartes logistics masters and redirected to the war effort. The time for politics was over. The time for retribution had begun. With the chain of command unified, the three chapters deployed according to their distinct philosophies of war, creating a multifaceted counter-attack that the Orks, for all their brutality, were ill-equipped to counter. The strategies employed by the Blood Angels, Salamanders, and Ultramarines highlighted the divergent lineages of their primarchs, yet they interlocked to form a perfect mechanism of destruction. The Blood Angels took the war to the skies and the enemy rear lines. Under Dante's direction, the Sons of Sanguinius utilized their mastery of aerial assault to shatter the Ork momentum. They did not man the trenches. Instead, they acted as a rapid reaction force of terrifying violence. Thunderhawk transporters dropped Predator tanks on the flanks of Ork armored columns, while Stormraven gunships strafed the open decks of the Gargants. The chapter's assault marines, equipped with jump packs, descended upon the Ork artillery positions like avenging angels. They engaged the enemy in close quarters, chainswords roaring, utilizing the shock and awe of their arrival to break the morale of the greenskin mobs. The Blood Angels' doctrine was one of controlled fury. They targeted the Ork leadership, identifying the knobs and warbosses who held the undisciplined hordes together. In the ruins of Hive Acheron, the Death Company, brothers lost to the Black Rage, their armor painted black and adorned with red crosses, were unleashed. These warriors felt no pain and knew no fear, tearing through the Ork lines with a savagery that unnerved even the greenskins. The Blood Angels turned the Orks' aggression against them, drawing them into overextended charges before descending from the heavens to sever the head of the beast. In stark contrast, the Salamanders deployed into the most heavily populated sectors of the remaining hives and the refugee convoys cluttering the ash wastes. Tushan, the chapter master of the Salamanders, held a philosophy that war was fought not just to defeat the enemy, but to protect the Emperor's subjects. The Salamanders did not view the civilians of Armageddon as collateral damage or logistical burdens, but as the very reason for their existence. They took up positions at the bridges of the river Styges and the gates of Hive Tartarus, placing their bodies between the retreating civilians and the advancing Orks. The Salamanders brought the fire of Nocturne to the ash wastes. Their preference for heat-based weaponry, flamers, meltaguns, and multi-meltas was perfectly suited for the close quarters fighting in the industrial sprawls. When the Orks attempted to storm the refugee camps, they were met by walls of promethium flame. The Salamanders fought with a stoic, immovable resolve. They did not give ground. A squad of Salamanders would hold a single intersection for days, their artificer armor blackened by soot and scored by choppa blades, refusing to retreat until every civilian transport had passed. Tushan himself was seen in the thick of the fighting, his thunder hammer crushing Ork skulls, serving as a beacon of hope for the terrified Steel Legionnaires who rallied around the green armored giants. This humanitarian focus did not blunt their effectiveness. Rather, it ensured that the logistical backbone of the planet, its workforce, remained intact. The Ultramarines, ever the statesmen and tacticians, assumed the role of the strategic anchor. They integrated themselves directly with the command structure of the Armageddon Steel Legion, acting as force multipliers. The Sons of Guilliman understood that a planet of this size could not be held by Space Marines alone. It required the disciplined mass of the Imperial Guard. The Ultramarine squads were broken down and attached to key Steel Legion regiments, providing the transhuman stiffening needed to turn a route into a firing line. They reorganized the broken supply lines, established overlapping fields of fire, and coordinated the artillery barrages that began to finally silence the Ork big guns. The flexibility of the Ultramarines allowed them to plug the gaps in the line that the Orks sought to exploit. Where the Blood Angels struck the head and the Salamanders held the shield, the Ultramarines were the gladius that thrust into the enemy's exposed ribs. They undertook precise, methodical operations to retake key manufactorums and water processing plants. Their bolter drill was impeccable, creating zones of death that the orcs could not cross. They did not succumb to the bloodlust of the melee unless necessary, preferring to dismantle the Ork WAAAGH with the cold, calculated application of superior firepower and maneuver. The impact of this tripartite counter-attack was immediate. The Ork advance, which had seemed unstoppable only days prior, ground to a halt. The Greenskins, accustomed to fighting the terrified and disorganized PDF, suddenly found themselves facing warriors who were faster, stronger, and vastly more intelligent than they were. The green tide hit a breakwater of ceramite and adamantium. In the ash wastes, the speed freaks found themselves hunted by land speeders and bow predators. In the hives, the commandos were flushed out by flamer teams and terminated by bolter fire. Dante's assumption of command also revitalized the human defenders. The news that the angels of death walked among them spread through the hive comms net, turning despair into fanatical courage. Soldiers who had thrown down their rifles picked them up again. Gangs from the underhives surged upwards to join the firing lines, eager to fight alongside the Sky Warriors. The factories of Armageddon Secundus, under the protection of the Astartes, roared back to life, churning out ammunition and spare parts to replace the material lost in the early routes. However, the arrival of the Astartes did not signal the end of the war, but rather its escalation to a level of violence previously unimagined. Ghazghkull Thraka, watching the skies burn from his command center in the conquered territories, did not despair. To the Ork warlord, the arrival of the Space Marines was the answer to his prayers to Gork and Mork. He had not come to Armageddon just to smash weaklings. He had come for the greatest fight in the galaxy. The presence of the Space Marines validated his WAAAGH. It meant that the universe was taking him seriously. Ghazghkull adapted his strategies with frightening speed. He realized that the Beakies were too few to cover the entire planet. He began to concentrate his forces into massive, dense spearheads, aiming to overwhelm the Astartes through sheer weight of numbers. He deployed his reserves of mega knobs and deft dreads, armored monstrosities that could withstand bolter fire, to engage the Marines in melee where their tactical advantages were negated. The war shifted from a conquest to a meat grinder. The battle for Tartarus Hive became the focal point of this new phase. Dante recognized that if Tartarus fell, the command and control for the entire southern continent would collapse. He consolidated the Blood Angels around the Hive spire, turning the governor's palace, once a symbol of corruption, into a fortress of righteousness. The skies above Tartarus darkened as millions of orcs descended upon the city. The siege that followed was a clash of titans. Blood Angel's sanguinary guard battled Orc Stormboys in aerial duels amidst the spires, their bodies falling like rain into the streets below. On the ground, dreadnoughts grappled with killicans in the plazas, shattering the marble statues of forgotten governors. Simultaneously, the salamanders pushed out into the ash wastes to secure the supply convoys, bringing promethium from the drilling rigs in the south. This campaign, known as the Road of Fire, saw the salamanders fighting a running battle against convoys of orc battle wagons. The environment suited the sons of Vulcan perfectly. Amidst the toxic dust storms and the heat of the geothermal vents, they utilized their land raider redeemers to carve a path of burning wreckage through the orc blockade. Tushan's leadership was pivotal here. When a massive orc force ambushed a convoy of wounded guardsmen, the chapter master led his Firedrake's Terminators into the center of the horde, holding the line for 6 hours until reinforcements could arrive. This act cemented the bond between the salamanders and the people of Armageddon, a bond that would be remembered long after the fires died down. The Ultramarines, meanwhile, launched a series of surgical strikes against the orc spaceports that had been established in the ruins of the fallen northern hives. By destroying the landing zones, they aimed to choke off the flow of reinforcements from the space hulk in orbit. These missions were executed with textbook precision. Drop pods would slam down into the center of the orc airfields, the doors blasting open to reveal squads of devastators who unleashed hell upon the parked fighter bombers and landas. Once the infrastructure was crippled, the Ultramarines would extract before the orcs could organize a counterattack. These raids bled the orc capacity to wage war, forcing Ghazghkull to rely on the forces he had already landed. As the weeks turned into months, the line stabilized. The Orks still held vast swathes of the planet, including the entirety of Armageddon Prime and the ruins of Hive Hades, but the collapse of the Imperium's hold on the world had been arrested. The arrest of von Straub had removed the cancer at the heart of the command structure, and Dante's leadership provided a unified vision. The war had become a stalemate, but it was a violent, high-intensity stalemate where the Space Marines acted as the fire brigades, rushing from one crisis point to another to beat back the green flames. Yet a new threat was beginning to manifest, one that the Astartes' tactical acumen could not easily counter. The Orks were not just invading, they were terraforming. The spores released by the millions of greenskins were taking root in the equatorial jungles and the sewage sumps of the hives. New generations of feral Orks were beginning to spawn in the wilderness, attacking supply lines from unexpected directions. Armageddon was becoming an Ork world on a biological level. The Astartes realized that a military victory alone would not suffice. They had to break the spirit of the WAAAGH before the planet itself turned against them. The focus of the War Council shifted towards a daring, decisive strike aimed at the heart of the Ork leadership, a gamble that would pit the oldest Space Marine commander against the most dangerous Ork warlord in history. The stage was set for the duel that would decide the fate of the sector. The counter-offensive to relieve Hive Tartarus began not with a bombardment, but with a synchronized assault that turned the tortured skies above the Hive spire into a tapestry of contrails and retro thruster burns. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels, having assumed supreme command of the Imperial forces, orchestrated a maneuver that leveraged the Adeptus Astartes' mastery of vertical warfare. The Hive City, a jagged mountain of Gothic architecture and industrial sprawl, had been partially overrun by the Greenskins, who were swarming up the lower hab blocks like termites infesting a dead tree. The Orks had established heavy flak batteries on the mid-hive gantries, creating a kill zone that had previously decimated Imperial Navy attempts to provide close air support. Dante's solution was a mass drop pod assault, a tactic known as the Steel Rain, executed with a precision that only the transhuman minds of the Space Marines could calculate. At high orbit, the strike cruisers of the Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and Salamanders aligned their bombardment vectors. Thousands of drop pods were jettisoned simultaneously. As they screamed through the atmosphere, their ablative heat shields glowing white-hot, they were preceded by a wave of Thunderhawk gunships and Stormraven interceptors. These aircraft did not engage the ground targets immediately. Instead, they flew suppression runs against the Ork aerial assets, engaging the crude but deadly Dakajets and fighter bombers that buzzed around the Hive spires. The air war was a chaotic swirl of dogfights, with the agile red-painted aircraft of the Blood Angels weaving through the thick industrial smog to blast the clumsy Ork craft out of the sky with las cannon and assault cannon fire. The drop pods slammed into the upper spires and the mid-hive plazas with the force of meteorites. The explosive bolts blew the ramps clear the moment the pods stabilized, and the Adeptus Astartes stormed out, bolters roaring. In the plaza of the Emperor's Ascendant, a vast ceremonial square located halfway up the primary spire, squads of Ultramarines' tactical marines established a beachhead instantly. They formed overlapping fields of fire, their Godwin-pattern bolters detonating the bodies of the surprised Orks who had been looting the surrounding statuary. The discipline of the Ultramarines was absolute. They moved as a single organism, clearing the plaza sector by sector, driving the Greenskins back toward the drop edges where they were cut down by heavy bolter fire. Higher up, near the Governor's Sanctum, the Blood Angels deployed their elite assault units. Vanguard veterans, their jump packs flaring like angry stars, leaped from the gantries to engage the Ork knobs who had taken residence in the aristocratic spires. This was a battle of blade and chainsword. The Blood Angels, driven by the genetic memory of their Primarch's fury, descended upon the Orks with a savagery that matched the Xeno's own bloodlust. In the tight confines of the Hive corridors, where the ceiling height allowed for little maneuver, the Astartes used their ceramite bulk as battering rams, smashing through barricades of scrap metal and furniture. Sounds of combat, the wet tear of chainswords through fungal flesh, the boom of bolt pistols, and the bestial roars of the Orks echoed through the ventilation shafts, broadcasting the arrival of the Emperor's angels to the terrified populace hiding in the lower levels. Simultaneously, the salamanders undertook the most dangerous task of the relief effort, the clearance of the manufactorum districts at the hive's base. Here, the fighting was not against the sky, but in the dark, sweltering heat of the foundries. The salamanders deployed from Thunderhawk transporters that hovered just meters above the Ferrocrete, disgorging land raider redeemers directly into the combat zone. The flamestorm cannons of the tanks bathed the Ork positions in promethium, cleansing the corridors with walls of fire. The Sons of Vulcan advanced methodically, their artificer-wrought armor shrugging off the crude, solid slug fire of the Ork Shuta boys. They did not just kill the enemy, they dismantled the Ork infrastructure, using melta charges to collapse the tunnels the Greenskins had dug to bypass the outer walls. The liberation of Tartarus was a multi-level dismantling of the Ork occupation, a brutal house cleaning that saw the Astartes reclaim the capital floor by bloody floor. While the battle for Tartarus raged within the vertical confines of the city, a conflict of even greater magnitude was unfolding in the ash wastes to the west. This was the domain of the god machines. The Legio Metallica, the Iron Skulls, had been humiliated in the early days of the war on Armageddon Prime, losing several engines to the ambush tactics of the Ork Gargants. Now, reinforced by battle groups from the Legio Ignatum and supported by Knights of House Krast, they sought retribution. The princeps of the Legio Metallica marched their engines out to meet the Ork heavy armor reserves that were attempting to reinforce the siege of Tartarus. The engagement took place on the Dead Lands, a vast expanse of flat, vitrified glass and gray dust that offered no cover and perfect firing lines. The Imperial Titan maniple consisted of 3 Warlord Titans, 5 Reavers, and a pack of Warhound Scouts. Opposing them was a mob of Ork Gargants, towering effigies of Gork and Mork constructed from the cannibalized wreckage of spaceships and destroyed hive sectors. The Ork machines were crude, smoke-belching monstrosities, their hulls covered in haphazard armor plates and bristling with an excessive number of cannons, rockets, and energy weapons. They moved with a lumbering, top-heavy gait, their massive tracks churning the ash into clouds that obscured the horizon. The duel began at extreme range. The Warlord Titans, ancient machines housing machine spirits that dated back to the Great Crusade, anchored their stabilizers and unleashed their volcano cannons. Beams of coherent light, hot enough to vaporize rock, slashed across the battlefield. One of the lead mega-gargants, a monstrosity named Ghazghkull, took a direct hit to its center mass. The Ork power fields, unstable, crackling barriers of energy generated by massive copper coils, flared violently and collapsed under the thermal stress. The laser continued through, melting a hole through the Gargant's torso the size of a hab block. Molten slag sprayed from the wound, and secondary explosions rippled through the machine as its ammunition stores cooked off. The Gargant took a staggering step forward before toppling face first into the ash, the impact registering as a seismic event on the sensors of the Imperial line. However, the Orks answered with their own brand of apocalyptic firepower. The remaining Gargants fired their liftadropas and belly guns. The sheer volume of ordnance was staggering. A Reaver Titan, Honoris Causa, was bracketed by solid shot the size of ground cars. Its void shields absorbed the first volley, shimmering with violet energy, but the relentless impacts overloaded the generators. The shields collapsed with a psychic scream felt by the crew, and the physical rounds hammered into the Titan's carapace. Armor plating that had withstood centuries of war was buckled and torn. A massive shell struck the Reaver's knee joint, shattering the actuator mechanisms. The Titan listed heavily, its gyroscope warning klaxons blaring, before it was finished off by a barrage of Ork rockets that engulfed its command head in fire. The battle became a chaotic melee of titanic proportions. Warhound Titans sprinted between the legs of the larger engines, using their speed to flank the lumbering Gargants and fire plasma blast guns into their exposed rear armor. The princeps of the Legio Metallica fought with cold, calculated fury, coordinating their fire to strip the shields from one target at a time before delivering the killing blow. The Orks, conversely, fought with manic enthusiasm, their big mechs pushing their reactors to the red line to power their energy weapons. The ash wastes were lit by the strobe light flashes of turbo laser destructors and the dirty yellow muzzle flashes of Ork macro cannons. By the time the dust settled, the wreckage of dozens of war engines littered the plain, burning pyres that would smoke for weeks. The Legio Metallica had taken grievous losses, but they had broken the back of the Ork heavy support, leaving the greenskin infantry in the hives without their god machines. From his command bridge aboard the massive space hulk Thraka in high orbit, Ork Thraka watched the tactical hololiths with a mind that was evolving beyond the comprehension of his species. The warlord saw the red icons of his gargants winking out in the ash wastes. He saw the drop pod assaults tearing into the heart of his captured hives. He felt the psychic backlash of the WAAAGH wavering as the Space Marines systematically dismantled his command structure. A lesser Ork would have flown into a rage, ordered a suicidal charge, and died fighting, but Ghazghkull had been touched by the gods. He possessed a clarity of vision that allowed him to see the war not as a single event, but as a stepping stone. Ghazghkull realized that the element of surprise was gone. The Imperium had committed its greatest warriors, and the stalemate had set in. He could continue to feed his boys into the meat grinder of Armageddon, and they would eventually be ground down by the endless logistics of the Administratum and the surgical strikes of the Astartes. Or he could leave. To the Ork mind, retreating is usually an act of cowardice, but Ghazghkull reframed it. He wasn't running away, he was going to get more boys. He was going to spread the WAAAGH to the stars, making the entire galaxy burn so that when he returned to Armageddon, he would bring a force that could not be stopped. With a series of guttural commands that terrified his subordinates, Ghazghkull ordered the Thraka and a fleet of his fastest escort cruisers to break orbit. He did not signal a general retreat to the boys on the ground. That would have caused a rout. Instead, he abandoned millions of his followers to their fate, using their continued resistance as a smokescreen to cover his departure. As the massive engines of the space hulk flared to life, pushing the vessel toward the Manville Point, the Imperial Navy attempted to intercept. However, the sheer mass of the Hulk and the suicidal bravery of its remaining escort squadrons allowed Ghazghkull to punch a hole through the blockade. The prophet of the WAAAGH translated into the warp, leaving the Armageddon system behind, but carrying the seeds of a future conflict that would eclipse the current devastation. On the surface, the war did not end with Ghazghkull's departure, but it changed character. Without the unifying will of the warlord, the Ork forces fractured into tribal warbands. The strategic coordination vanished, replaced by localized pockets of fanatical resistance. This allowed the Imperial forces to transition from defense to reconquest. The primary objective of this final phase was the liberation of Hive Hades, the symbol of Imperial defiance. The relief force that broke through to Hades was a combined spearhead of Blood Angels Terminators and the remnants of the Steel Legion's heavy armor regiments. They expected to find a besieged fortress. Instead, they found a graveyard. The outer walls of Hades had been breached in a dozen places, the Ferrocrete pulverized by weeks of bombardment. The streets were choked with the dead, mounds of Ork corpses piled so high they blocked the thoroughfares, intermingled with the crushed remains of Chimera transports and the bodies of the heroic defenders. The fighting here had been hand-to-hand, a savage brawl for survival that had consumed the city. The spearhead fought its way to the central plaza, the site of the final stand. The devastation was absolute. The spire of the comms tower had collapsed, and the ground was slick with a sludge of blood and oil. It was here, amidst the carnage, that the Astartes found him. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick lay near the center of the plaza, surrounded by a circle of dead Ork knobs. The corpse of Warboss Uglehard lay nearby, its head severed by the chainsword that was still gripped in Yarrick's remaining hand. The Commissar was unconscious, his body a ruin of lacerations and burns, his right arm severed at the elbow and cauterized by the heat of the Ork power claw. The discovery was a moment of profound reverence. The Space Marines, warriors who knew no fear and offered respect to few mortals, lowered their bolters. Apothecaries from the Blood Angels rushed to the fallen hero, stabilizing his vitals with advanced combat drugs and stasis fields. Yarrick was not merely a survivor, he was the embodiment of the indomitable human spirit. He had held the line against a tide that should have swallowed the world. As the Med-Evac Thunderhawk lifted him from the ruins, the surviving Steel Legionnaires who had emerged from the bunkers wept openly, chanting his name. The old man had lived. The formal conclusion of the Second War for Armageddon was declared in the year 942 of the 41st millennium. The though the fighting would continue in the form of cleanup operations for years to come. The cost of the victory was staggering. The infrastructure of the planet was in ruins. Armageddon Prime was a wasteland, its hives hollowed out and its population decimated. The equatorial jungle was now infested with feral orcs, a permanent ecological scar that would plague the world forever. The industrial output of the planet had been slashed by more than half, threatening supply shortages across the segmentum. Yet, the planet remained in Imperial hands. The flag of the Aquila was raised once more over the spire of Hive Tartarus. The Inquisition arrived in the wake of the Astartes, not to purge the population as they had after the First War, for the enemy this time was Xenos, not daemonic, but to ensure that the taint of the Orc spores was contained as much as possible. The survivors of the war, the hardened veterans of the Steel Legion, began the long, arduous task of rebuilding their world on the mountains of ash and bone. They did so with a grim determination, knowing that the beast had not been slain, merely driven back. They rebuilt the walls higher, forged the armor thicker, and trained their children to hold a lasgun before they could read, for the wind blowing from the stars carried a promise. Ghazghkull Thraka would return. The silence that fell upon the Armageddon system following the departure of Ghazghkull Thraka was not the peace of victory, but the suffocating quiet of a held breath. While the Adeptus Astartes withdrew to their chapter monasteries to repair their war gear, and the Adeptus Munitorum scribes began the impossible task of tallying the dead, Commissar Sebastian Yarrick lay in the Medicae sanctum of the cruiser Purgatory, his body shattered but his mind burning with a singular, terrible realization. The old man knew what the High Lords and the planetary governors refused to accept. The Second War for Armageddon had not been a defeat for the Orcs. It had been a rehearsal. Ghazghkull had not fled out of fear. He had left because he had learned everything he needed to know about Imperial defenses, and he was going to gather a force that would make his initial invasion look like a border skirmish. Yarrick's refusal to accept the laurels of retirement was immediate and absolute. The Imperium attempted to honor him with a governorship or a high-ranking position within the Segmentum Command, roles that would have seen him live out his days in comfort behind thick walls. He rejected them all. To Yarrick, the war was not over as long as the beast lived. Despite his advanced age and the extensive bionics now required to keep his body functioning, including the fearsome power claw he had taken from Warboss Ugglehard, which he had surgically attached to his severed arm as a symbol of defiance, he petitioned for a crusade of pursuit. He argued that allowing Ghazghkull to escape into the deep void was a strategic error of galactic proportions. His warnings were met with skepticism by the comfortable lords of Terra, but his reputation among the military caste was unassailable. He was granted command of a task force to hunt down the warlord. This expedition led Yarrick away from the ash wastes of Armageddon and into the dark, uncharted wilderness of the Golgotha sector. The pursuit was relentless, lasting for years, as Yarrick tracked the radioactive wake of the Orc fleet. He finally cornered his quarry on the red sands of Golgotha, a barren mining world that Ghazghkull had seized to replenish his resources. The Battle of Golgotha was intended to be the strike that decapitated the WAAAGH before it could regenerate. Yarrick deployed the full might of his task force, spearheading the assault from the command deck of the Fortress of Arrogance, a Baneblade super heavy tank that had been modified to serve as his mobile headquarters. The engagement, however, revealed the terrifying evolution of Ghazghkull's tactical acumen. The Orcs did not charge mindlessly into the Imperial guns. They utilized the terrain of Golgotha, drawing the Imperial armor into narrow canyons and pre-sighted kill zones. The trap was sprung with a mechanical precision that stunned the Imperial tacticians. Ghazghkull had massed a formation of heavy walkers and looted tanks that outnumbered the Imperial force 3-1. The Fortress of Arrogance was isolated, its support vehicles stripped away by waves of Orc tankbustas. In a final, humiliating blow, the Great Baneblade was disabled, its tracks shattered and its primary cannon silenced. Yarrick fought from the wreckage, his Storm Bolter and Power Claw reaping a toll of greenskin lives, but he was eventually overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the enemy. He was not killed in the fighting, nor was he executed upon capture, a fate that befell most of his men. Instead, he was taken in chains to the warlord's flagship. For weeks, Yarrick was a prisoner of the beast. He was subjected to tortures that would have broken a lesser man, yet the true agony was psychological. Ghazghkull did not want information. He wanted to study his nemesis. He forced Yarrick to watch from the observation decks as the Ork fleet grew, as new ships were cobbled together from the wreckage of the Imperial task force. Finally, in an act that displayed a terrifying alien complexity, Ghazghkull ordered Yarrick to be dragged to a shuttle bay. The warlord did not speak in the crude, guttural monosyllables typical of his kind. He spoke with the weight of a prophet. He told Yarrick that he was being released because a great enemy was too valuable to waste. Ghazghkull needed the Imperium to be ready. He needed Armageddon to be the perfect arena. He was sending Yarrick back to prepare the defenses, ensuring that when the WAAAGH returned, the fight would be worthy of the Ork gods. Yarrick was jettisoned in a shuttle, a lone survivor bearing a message of doom, condemned to live with the knowledge that his life was a gift from the monster he had sworn to destroy. When Yarrick returned to Armageddon, his report chilled the blood of the sector command. The skepticism that had once greeted him evaporated in the face of his first-hand account of the WAAAGH scale. The planet, still scarred and rebuilding from the previous war, was immediately placed on a footing of total war. The 50 years that followed, known as the Interbellum, saw the greatest fortification effort in the history of the Segmentum Solar. The Administratum designated Armageddon as a maximum priority defensive zone. The rebuilding was not an act of restoration, but of hardening. The hive cities, those mountainous spires of humanity, were transformed into self-contained fortresses. The Void's shield generators, which had failed or been bypassed in the Second War, were stripped out and replaced with redundant, overlapping field matrices capable of withstanding orbital bombardment. The hive structures themselves were reinforced with layers of adamantium plating and ferrocrete bunkers. The connecting highways and maglev lines, previously the arteries of commerce, were lined with defensive hardpoints, tank traps, and hidden artillery silos. The entire geography of the industrial zones was reshaped to create kill boxes and crossfire zones. The human cost of this fortification was astronomical. The population of Armageddon was tithed ruthlessly. The birth rate was artificially stimulated, and the death rate in the factories skyrocketed as shifts were extended to 20 hours a day. Every citizen, from the lowliest dregs of the underhive to the scions of the minor nobility, was integrated into the defense plan. The recruitment for the Armageddon Steel Legion was increased tenfold. Gangs were rounded up by the thousands and conscripted directly into penal legions or regular infantry regiments. The planetary governor enacted the Wall of Bodies doctrine, ensuring that for every meter of ground on Armageddon, there were 10 rifles ready to defend it. Furthermore, the Adeptus Astartes established a permanent vigil over the world. While they could not station full chapters on the surface indefinitely, a rotating watch was established. Strike cruisers from the Black Templars, the Salamanders, and the Blood Angels maintained a constant patrol presence in the system's outer reaches. The orbital defense platforms, which had been easily swept aside by the first space Hulk, were rebuilt as massive star fortresses, bristling with lance batteries and nova cannons. The planet was turned into a loaded gun, pointed at the stars, waiting for the trigger to be pulled. Yet, while the Imperium looked outward, fortifying the walls against the external threat, a cancer was metastasizing deep within the planet's own shadow. Hermann von Straub, the disgraced former overlord whose incompetence had nearly cost the Imperium the world, had not perished. Following his arrest by Commander Dante, he had been slated for transport to Terra to stand trial for high treason. However, during the chaotic transfer of power and the confusion of the post-war cleanup, the shuttle carrying him was intercepted. Whether by loyalist elements of his personal guard or through the machinations of darker powers, von Straub escaped. He did not flee the system. His arrogance was such that he could not conceive of life anywhere but on the world he believed was his birthright. Von Straub vanished into the deep underhives and the lawless expanses of the equatorial jungle. For decades he festered in the darkness, a bitter, madness-racked creature consuming his own hatred. He viewed the Imperial Guard and the Space Marines not as saviors, but as usurpers who had stolen his planet. His mind, fractured by humiliation and isolation, concocted a plan of revenge that crossed the ultimate line of heresy. Von Straub began to reach out to the feral Ork tribes that still infested the jungles and the mountains. Using secret communication channels and codes known only to the planetary governor, he made contact with the greenskin agents. He believed, in his delusion, that he could manipulate the orcs, using them as a tool to destabilize the Imperial rule so that he could emerge from the chaos to reclaim his throne. He provided the Xenos with codes to the planetary defense grids, maps of the new fortifications, and schedules of the supply convoys. The Prince of the Hollows, as he came to be known in the Underhive myths, became the greatest traitor in the sector's history, actively paving the way for the very monsters that had ruined his life. While von Strab plotted in the dark, and Yarrick prepared the light, Ghazghkull Thraka was busy reshaping the geopolitical reality of the Orc race. The warlord had spent the intervening decades engaging in a campaign of unification that had no precedent in galactic history. He did not merely defeat rival warlords, he absorbed them. He traveled from system to system, smashing Orc empires and offering the survivors a choice: join the Great WAAAGH or die. Most joined, drawn by the palpable aura of power that surrounded the prophet. Ghazghkull's empire grew to encompass thousands of light years. He recruited the legendary Mechbu Orkheims, a genius of engineering whose insanity was matched only by his brilliance. Under Ghazghkull's patronage, Orkheims developed technologies that defied the crude understanding of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The most significant of these was the perfection of teleporta technology. While Orcs had always used crude teleportation for small squads, Orkheims scaled it up to industrial levels. He weaponized asteroids, hollowing them out and fitting them with massive drives and teleportation arrays. These rocks were designed not just to drop troops, but to act as anchors. The plan was simple and devastating. Ghazghkull would not need to win the Void War to land his troops. He would ram the rocks through the orbital defenses, smashing them into the planet's surface. Once embedded, these rocks would activate their massive teleportas, beaming millions of reinforcements directly from the fleet in orbit onto the planet's surface, bypassing the void shields and the defensive walls entirely. It was a strategy that rendered the 50 years of Imperial fortification partially obsolete before the first shot was fired. By the closing years of the 41st millennium, the pieces were set. The Armageddon system was a fortress world bristling with guns, led by a legendary commissar who knew the enemy better than he knew himself. Opposing it was a green tide of impossible magnitude, led by a prophet beast who wielded the power of a god and the cunning of a general, armed with technology that could tear holes in reality. The interbellum was drawing to a close. The silence of the void was about to be shattered by the roar of 5 million engines, as the third war for Armageddon loomed on the horizon, promising a slaughter that would drown the stars in blood. The date of the return was chosen with a malice that proved the alien possessed a memory as long and bitter as any human grudge. It was the year 998 of the 41st millennium, exactly 57 years to the day since the Imperium had declared victory in the Second War for Armageddon. The planet was in the throes of celebration, marking the feast of the Emperor's Ascension, a holiday that had been repurposed on this world to commemorate the survival of the population against the green tide of the previous generation. In the hive spires, bells tolled and choirs sang hymns of deliverance, while in the ash wastes, the Steel Legion regiments paraded in their ochre coats, their tanks freshly painted and blessed by the Ministorum priests. The atmosphere was one of defiant pride, a collective assertion that humanity had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. Deep in the command bunker of Hive Hades, however, there was no celebration. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, now an ancient figure kept alive by Juvenat treatments, extensive bionics, and sheer force of will, watched the long-range augur arrays with a sense of grim inevitability. He had felt the psychic pressure building for weeks, a headache that sat behind his eyes like a tumor, the same sensation he had felt half a century ago. When the first alarms began to scream across the system's monitoring network, they did not signal a raid or a probing force. They signaled the end of the sky. The invasion fleet that translated from the warp at the system's edge was of a magnitude that defied the logic of naval warfare. It was not a fleet in the traditional sense. It was a solid wall of scrap iron and thrust. There were thousands of kill cruisers, terror ships, and ram ships, surrounding a core of space hulks so massive they possessed their own gravitational pull. But unlike the previous war, where the Orks had sought to engage the Imperial Navy in a contest of void supremacy, this fleet had a singular, suicidal purpose. They ignored the engagement zones. They ignored the flanking maneuvers of the system defense boats. The entire mass of the Ork armada accelerated toward Armageddon with reckless abandon, shielding their approach with the sheer volume of their wreckage. The opening gambit of the Third War for Armageddon was not a bombardment of macro cannons, but a physical assault on the planet's crust. Ghazghkull Thraka, utilizing the twisted genius of his chief mechboy, Orkhimes, had weaponized the debris of the system itself. Hundreds of hollowed-out asteroids, fitted with colossal, unstable engines and crude force fields, were hurled at the planet. These were the rocks. They were not precision instruments. They were continent killers. The orbital defense platforms, rebuilt at such cost during the interbellum, poured fire into the incoming avalanche. Nova cannons shattered dozens of the rocks, turning them into expanding clouds of dust, and lance batteries sliced others into harmless fragments. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every rock destroyed, 3 more punched through the defensive grid. The impact of the rocks upon the surface of Armageddon was a cataclysm that registered on seismographs as far away as the polar caps. They slammed into the ash wastes, the equatorial jungles, and the outskirts of the hive cities with the force of tactical nuclear weapons. The kinetic energy of the strikes threw millions of tons of dust and ash into the upper atmosphere, instantly blotting out the sun and plunging the world into a twilight of choking gray smog. But these projectiles did not simply explode. As they plowed furrows kilometers long into the earth, their retro thrusters firing in a chaotic attempt to arrest their momentum, they revealed their true purpose. They were not just bombs, they were beachheads. The rocks were heavily fortified bunkers, their interiors honeycombed with tunnels and barracks. More terrifyingly, they were anchors for the Orks' new tactical mastery, heavy-grade teleportation technology. As the dust settled around the glowing, heat-fused craters of the impact zones, massive energy spikes flared from the wreckage. The teleporters engaged, tearing holes in reality to beam millions of greenskins directly from the orbiting fleet onto the planet's surface. This bypassed the vulnerable atmospheric entry phase that had cost the Orks so dearly in the Second War. There were no dropships to shoot down. One moment a crater was empty, the next it was teeming with thousands of warriors, death dreads, and battle wagons, materializing in flashes of sickly green light. The scale of the mobilization was immediately apparent to the strategic command in Hive Tartarus. This was not a raid, nor a simple invasion, it was a migration. The concentration of Orks descending upon Armageddon was the largest gathering of the greenskin race ever recorded by the Imperium. Ghazghkull had united tribes from across the galaxy, pulling in the feral Orks of Octarius, the mechanized hordes of the Cheredin sector, and the pirate fleets of the Maelstrom. Every clan was represented: the speed-obsessed Evil Sunts, the heavy weapon-toting Bad Moons, the feral Snakebites, and the disciplined, black-armored Goths. The Imperial response, dictated by contingency plans laid down by Yarrick during the 50 years of preparation, was equally monumental. The call for aid had gone out the moment the warp shadows were detected, and the Imperium answered with a ferocity that matched the threat. Over 20 distinct chapters of the Adeptus Astartes committed forces to the war zone, representing the largest gathering of space marines since the dark days of the Horus Heresy. The Black Templars, led by High Marshal Helbrecht, brought their crusade fleets to scour the void. The Salamanders returned to protect the civilians they had bonded with decades prior. The Space Wolves, the White Scars, the Angels of Fire, and the Exorcists all deployed strike forces to the surface. On the ground, the mobilization of the Imperial Guard was total. The Armageddon Steel Legion, already one of the most numerous and mechanized forces in the galaxy, was bolstered by regiments from hundreds of worlds. Cadian Shock Troopers, Krieg Death Corps, Catachan Jungle Fighters, and Elysian Drop Troops poured into the staging areas. The Titan legions walked once more, the god machines of the Legio Tempestus and Legio Victorum sounding their war horns as they strode out to meet the gargants that were already being constructed in the shadow of the rocks. The sheer density of combatants turned the ash wastes into a churning sea of tread marks and blood. However, the strength of the Imperial defense was undermined from within by a betrayal as ancient as it was petty. The defensive strategy relied on the impregnable nature of the Hive cities, with their overlapping void shields and kill zones designed to bleed the Ork armies white before they could reach the inner sanctums. Yet as the rocks landed and the green tide surged forward, inexplicable failures began to plague the defensive grid. Void shield generators protecting key industrial sectors of Hive Tempestora suffered catastrophic power fluctuations at the precise moment Ork artillery barrages began. Secret maintenance tunnels, sealed and erased from the official schematics for centuries, were suddenly breached by Ork commandos who knew exactly where the sensor-blind spots were located. The architect of this sabotage was Hermann von Straub. The disgraced former overlord had not died in the Underhive as many had assumed. Instead, he had festered in the darkness, his mind warped by bitterness and a delusional belief in his own right to rule. He had made contact with Ghazghkull's agents, offering the one thing the Orks could not build, the keys to the planet. Von Straub had provided the Orks with the command codes for the planetary defense network and the detailed blueprints of the Hive fortifications. In the command center of the Ork forces, located within a massive, hollowed-out volcano in the equatorial jungle, von Straub stood alongside the Council of Warlords. He was a grotesque figure, clad in the tattered, filth-encrusted remnants of his governor's finery, his skin sallow and his eyes manic. He believed he was using the Orks as mercenaries to retake his throne, unaware that to the Greenskins, he was nothing more than a useful, amusing pet, a humie who knew good tricks. His betrayal allowed Ghazghkull's forces to bypass the most lethal of the killing fields. Entire regiments of the Steel Legion were encircled and massacred because the Orks maneuvered through impassable terrain that von Straub had identified as structurally unsound or unguarded. The treason was most devastating at Hive Tempestora. The Hive, a linchpin of the production capacity on Armageddon Prime, fell within days of the initial landings. Armed with von Straub's codes, Ork mechboys overrode the gate mechanisms, throwing the massive adamantium portals wide open. The massacre that followed was absolute. The Orks did not just conquer Tempestora, they turned it into a charnel house, enslaving the population to work the forges they had just captured. The fall of Tempestora broke the northern defensive line, forcing the Imperial commanders to scramble their reserves to prevent a total collapse of the continent. As the season of fire consumed the world, the reality of the Third War became clear. This was not a war of maneuver or strategy in the conventional sense. It was a war of annihilation. The ash wastes were so choked with combatants that maneuver was impossible. There was only the grind. The skies were a constant firestorm of dogfights between Imperial thunderbolts and Ork dakajets. The ground shook ceaselessly from the tread of millions of tanks. And at the center of the storm, the great beast, Ghazghkull Thraka, broadcast a signal across all frequencies, a roar of challenge that was not just for Yarrick, but for the galaxy itself. He had returned to his favorite playground, and he intended to burn it down to the bedrock. The 57th anniversary of his defeat had become the first day of his greatest triumph, and the war for Armageddon had transitioned from a battle for territory into a battle for the survival of the human spirit in the Segmentum Solar. The fall of Hive Tempestora to the treachery of Hermann von Straub was a strategic catastrophe, but the fate of Hive Hades was a tragedy born of pure, vindictive spite. In the Second War for Armageddon, Hades had been the anvil upon which the Ork WAAAGH was broken, the fortress where Commissar Yarrick had held the line against impossible odds. It stood as a symbol of Imperial defiance, a monument to the idea that the green tide could be halted by faith and steel. Ghazghkull Thraka had not forgotten this. The great beast possessed a memory that eclipsed the crude biological limitations of his species, and he understood the power of symbols far better than the administratum strategists gave him credit for. He knew that to break the spirit of Armageddon, he could not simply conquer Hades, he had to erase it. Consequently, there was no ground assault on Hive Hades in the opening stages of the Third War. There were no siege lines dug in the ash, no columns of battle wagons testing the outer perimeters, and no waves of stormboys assaulting the spires. Instead, Ghazghkull directed the orbital trajectory of his asteroid rocks with a cruel precision. From the bridge of his flagship, he ordered a bombardment that was not designed to soften a target for occupation, but to annihilate it completely. The rocks that descended upon Hades were not troop carriers or teleportation platforms. They were solid, multi-gigaton kinetic kill vehicles. The destruction was visible from the stratosphere. The first rock struck the primary spire of Hades' hive near its apex, the sheer kinetic force shattering the void shields that had been compromised by the overwhelming volume of fire. The impact shore the top third of the hive city from its foundations, sending millions of tons of ferrocrete and plasteel cascading down into the lower hab blocks. Before the dust could even settle, subsequent rocks hammered the base of the city and the surrounding industrial zones. The seismic shockwaves liquefied the ground beneath the hive, causing the ancient, mountain-sized structure to buckle and collapse inward. Within the span of a single hour, the city that had defied a WAAAGH for months in the previous war was reduced to a smoking crater of twisted metal and pulverized rock. The population, numbering in the billions, was largely extinguished in the initial collapse, their screams silenced by the roar of falling continents. This act of orbital execution served a dual purpose for the warlord. Strategically, it denied the Imperial defenders their most potent rallying point and a key logistical hub in the southern hemisphere. But psychologically, it was a message sent directly to Commissar Yarrick. Ghazghkull was declaring that the rules of the game had changed. He would not grant his old enemy the dignity of a rematch on the same ground. By obliterating Hades, he stripped Yarrick of his fortress, forcing the old man to fight in the open, on terms dictated by the orcs. It was a masterstroke of terror tactics that sent a ripple of despair through the planetary defense forces, who watched on long-range picked feeds as their symbol of invincibility was wiped from the map. However, a hive city does not simply disappear. The collapse of Hades created a mountain range of debris, a chaotic labyrinth of crushed hab blocks, twisted manufactorum pipes, and subterranean service tunnels that had survived the surface devastation. This ruin, known quickly as the Hades debris field, became the site of one of the most brutal, claustrophobic conflicts of the war. While the city as a functioning entity was dead, the war for its corpse began almost immediately. Deep within the bowels of the ruins, surviving pockets of Steel Legionnaires, Hive Gangers, and PDF troopers found themselves trapped in air pockets and sealed bunkers. These survivors, numbering in the tens of thousands, were cut off from high command, buried beneath kilometers of rubble. Yet they did not surrender. They adapted. The battle for the hive debris evolved into a nightmarish subterranean guerrilla war. Ork WAAAGHs and commandos, drawn like moths to a flame by the prospect of scavenging the high-grade technology buried in the wreck, began to tunnel into the debris field. They utilized mole launchers and crude boring machines to breach the buried vaults, expecting to find easy pickings. Instead, they found a cornered, desperate enemy fighting with the ferocity of rats in a trap. The fighting in the Hades debris was characterized by zero-visibility engagements and close-quarters savagery. Lasguns were of limited use in the twisted, smoke-choked crawlspaces. The war was fought with trench clubs, knives, and improvised explosives. Steel Legion engineers rigged collapsing tunnels to crush orc scavenging parties, while gangs utilized their knowledge of the old underhive vent systems to launch hit-and-run ambushes on orc encampments established on the surface of the rubble pile. It was a war of sound and smell, the echo of a heavy boot on metal, the stench of fungal blood and promethium. Every meter of the debris field was contested, and although the hive was gone, the orcs found that the ground itself continued to bleed them. This resistance tied down significant numbers of orc infantry who were obsessed with looting the ruins, preventing them from reinforcing the main battlefronts pushing toward Hive Acheron. While the ruins of Hades burned, the morale of the Imperial forces across the rest of the planet was nearing a breaking point. The loss of the hive, coupled with the betrayal at Tempestora and the relentless tide of greenskins pouring from the rocks, had created an atmosphere of inevitable doom. The Planetary Command Council, operating out of Hive Tartarus, was paralyzed by the scale of the invasion. Reports of mutinies and mass desertions began to filter in from the front lines. The soldiers of Armageddon needed a savior, and the Imperium, in its desperate hour, provided one. The arrival of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick in the Armageddon system was not a quiet affair. He did not arrive aboard a fast courier ship to slip unnoticed onto the surface. He arrived at the head of a relief fleet, aboard a heavy transport that carried his personal command vehicle, the Fortress of Arrogance. This Baneblade super heavy tank, a relic of the dark age of technology modified with a pulpit from which Yarrick could address his troops, was a symbol as potent as the Commissar himself. When Yarrick made planetfall, he did not head for the safety of the command bunkers. He ordered his transport to land directly at the staging grounds of the chaotic front lines near the Hemlock River. The effect of Yarrick's return was electric. The news traveled across the Vox networks at the speed of light. Old Baal I is back. To the soldiers of the Steel Legion, Yarrick was more than a commander. He was a living saint of the Emperor, a man who had looked the beast in the eye and lived. When the ramp of the heavy lander dropped and the Fortress of Arrogance rolled out, its twin battle cannons elevated and its heavy bolters cycling, a roar went up from the assembled regiments that drowned out the thunder of the distant artillery. Yarrick stood in the command pulpit, his bionic eye glowing with a harsh red light, his power claw raised in defiance. He did not offer them safety. He did not promise that they would live. He promised them that they would kill orcs. Yarrick immediately assumed supreme command of the planetary defense, bypassing the clumsy bureaucracy of the existing council. His authority was absolute, granted not just by his rank, but by the sheer weight of his legend. He reorganized the shattered defensive lines with the cold pragmatism of a man who has spent 50 years studying his enemy. He knew that static defense against the current orc strategy was suicide. He ordered mobile counterattacks, utilizing the mechanized speed of the Steel Legion to hit the orc columns as they moved between the rocks. He integrated the newly arrived Space Marine contingents into the battle plan, using the Astartes as the tip of the spear to break the orc momentum while the Imperial Guard held the flanks. More importantly, Yarrick weaponized his own presence. He knew that Ghazghkull was watching. He made sure that his banner was visible on the most contested battlefields. He broadcasted challenges on open frequencies, taunting the orc warlords, drawing their aggression toward his position and away from the vulnerable civilian evacuation routes. The orcs, driven by their cultural obsession with strength, began to lose their tactical cohesion as warbosses vied for the honor of killing the old man. Attacks that should have been coordinated breakthroughs devolved into disorganized charges at Yarrick's position, where they were met by the massed firepower of the Fortress of Arrogance and the disciplined volleys of the Steel Legion elite. Yarrick had turned himself into the ultimate distraction, buying precious time for the sector reinforcements to arrive. However, as the weeks turned into months, a disturbing realization began to dawn upon Yarrick and the high command of the Adeptus Astartes. The war was not following the standard trajectory of an orc invasion. Typically, a WAAAGH operates on momentum. It crashes against a world, conquers it, and moves on, or it breaks against the defenses and dissolves into infighting. The Third War for Armageddon was different. The orcs were not just trying to win, they were settling in. The rocks were not merely landing craft, they were being converted into permanent fortresses, factories, and breeding grounds. The orcs were terraforming the ash wastes, erecting massive effigies to Gork and Mork, and establishing a logistical network that suggested they had no intention of leaving. Yarrick, with his intimate understanding of the greenskin psyche, realized the horrifying truth. Ghazghkull Thraka was not trying to conquer Armageddon in the traditional sense. He was not looking to plant a flag and claim the world for an empire. He was building an arena. The warlord had learned from his defeat at Golgotha and his escape into the void. He understood that the Imperium was a reactive beast, one that would pour endless resources into a meat grinder to hold a vital world. By turning Armageddon into an eternal battlefield, Ghazghkull was creating a Valhalla for his species, a place where the fighting never ended, where the strongest enemies would constantly come to him. This was a war of attrition, but one where the enemy actually benefited from the stalemate. Every day the war continued, the WAAAGH energy grew stronger. The orcs were fighting for the sheer joy of violence, and this psychic resonance was drawing more greenskins from across the galaxy. Armageddon had become a beacon. The Festival of Violence, as Yarrick grimly termed it in his private logs, was a self-sustaining cycle. The Imperium was forced to feed regiments into the furnace to keep the planet, and the orcs were happy to keep burning them. This was not a military campaign to be won. It was an ecological disaster to be managed. The terrifying genius of Ghazghkull's plan was that he had removed the possibility of a decisive Imperial victory. If the Imperium committed more forces, the fight got better and more orcs came. If the Imperium withdrew, they lost the Segmentum's primary armory. Yarrick understood that he was trapped in a game where the only winning move was to kill the player, not the pieces. The war shifted from a desperate defense of territory to a grinding industrial slaughter, where the metric of success was not kilometers gained, but the kill ratio achieved before the inevitable counterattack. The conflict stabilized into a gruesome equilibrium. The Ash Wastes became a no-man's land of churned mud and bone, where tank battles involving thousands of vehicles raged for weeks over patches of irradiated dirt that held no strategic value other than being a place to kill. The orbital space remained contested, preventing the Imperial Navy from delivering the exterminatus that some radical inquisitors began to whisper about. To destroy Armageddon would be to admit defeat and cripple the Imperial war machine. To save it required bleeding the Imperium white. In this crucible, the Third War for Armageddon ceased to be a mere historical event and became a state of existence for the inhabitants of the sector. A generation of soldiers was born, fought, and died without ever knowing a sky that wasn't choked with orc spores and drop pod contrails. Yarrick, standing atop his fortress, looked out over the burning horizon of the world he had sworn to protect, knowing that his nemesis was out there in the green haze, laughing. The martyrdom of Hades was just the opening ceremony. The true sacrifice was the entirety of Armageddon itself, offered up on the altar of war to satisfy the hunger of a beast that had outgrown its creators. The galaxy watched as the Armageddon sector burned, a beacon of total war that threatened to consume everything in its path. The arrival of the Black Templars in the Armageddon system marked a fundamental shift in the theological and tactical disposition of the Imperial defense. While the Blood Angels brought the noble fury of Sanguinius, and the Salamanders brought the protective fire of Vulcan, the Black Templars brought the cold, unyielding judgment of the Emperor himself. Their fleet did not translate from the warp with the intention of merely relieving a besieged world. They arrived to execute a crusade. Leading this armada was High Marshal Helbrecht, a warrior of singular vision who commanded from the bridge of the Eternal Crusader, a Gloriana-class battleship that dwarfed the escort cruisers of the Imperial Navy. Helbrecht viewed the defensive posture of the other chapters with a degree of disdain. To a Black Templar, to defend is to admit the enemy has the initiative. Upon entering the system, Helbrecht immediately dispersed his fleet, ordering his battle barges and strike cruisers to engage the Ork rocks and space hulks in point-blank void duels, turning the orbital space into a grinding melee of macro cannons and boarding torpedoes. However, the war required a presence on the surface, and specifically within the industrial sprawls that were rapidly being overrun by the greenskin migration. Among the thousands of strategic points on Armageddon Secundus, the hive city of Hellsreach stood out not for its political prestige, but for its logistical necessity. Located on the precipitous coastline of the Tempest Ocean, Hellsreach was a vital port city, responsible for processing the promethium drilled from the seabed and shipping the heavy munitions produced in the southern hemisphere. If Hellsreach fell, the supply chains feeding the defense of Hive and Furnace and the surviving infrastructure of the south would be severed. It was to this grim, smog-choked metropolis that Helbrecht assigned Reclusiarchmeric Grimaldus. The assignment was not initially viewed as an honor. Grimaldus, a chaplain of terrifying piety and martial skill, had served at Helbrecht's side for decades. To be sent to the surface to die in a siege while his High Marshal fought the true war in the stars felt, to the Reclusiarch, like a dismissal. Yet the deployment was a test of faith and duty. Grimaldus descended to the surface with a crusade force that was numerically small but spiritually immense, 3 squads of initiates, a handful of sword brethren, and his own command squad. They made planetfall not in the pristine parade grounds of the upper spire, but amidst the oil-slicked docks and the ash-covered ferrocrete of the lower districts. The city they found was a sprawling, ugly monument to industry, populated by a citizenry hardened by generations of toxic labor and now facing extinction. The defense of Hellsreach was a campaign that would be studied by Imperial tacticians for centuries, not for its brilliant maneuvers, but for the sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness of its commanders. Grimaldus found himself sharing command with Colonel Saren of the 101st Armageddon Steel Legion. Saren was a man of iron discipline, a career soldier who initially viewed the Astartes as unpredictable zealots who would disrupt his carefully laid firing lines. The friction between the transhuman warrior monk and the mortal attrition strategist defined the early weeks of the siege. The Black Templars did not sit in the trenches. They prowled the no-man's land, launching spoiling attacks into the gathering Ork hordes, butchering the vanguard forces to goad the main body into premature assaults. The siege began in earnest when the Ork fleet, having bypassed the orbital blockade through sheer weight of numbers, began to drop rocks directly into the ash wastes surrounding the hive. Simultaneously, the Tempest Ocean, usually a barrier against invasion, became a vector of attack. The Orks had constructed crude, watertight submersibles and retrofitted naval vessels, launching an amphibious assault against the Hellsreach docks. The city was squeezed from the land and the sea. The sky turned black with the exhaust of Ork fighter bombers, and the streets ran slick with a mixture of rain, oil, and blood. The battle for Hellsreach was fought block by block, manufactorum by manufactorum. The Steel Legion, fighting from their chimeras and fortified hab blocks, provided the anvil. They established kill zones in the narrow industrial canyons, flooding intersections with heavy bolter fire and Law's volleys. The Black Templars acted as the hammer. Whenever the Orks achieved a breakthrough, whenever a knob mob threatened to overrun a command post, Grimaldus and his brothers were there. The Reclusiarch was a terrifying figure on the battlefield, clad in black power armor adorned with parchment scriptures and the bones of martyrs. His skull-faced helm and the roar of his Crozius Arcanum became the only morale boost the defenders had. He did not offer them hope of survival. He offered them the chance to die with purpose. Under his influence, the dock workers and militia fought with a fanaticism that surprised even the Orks, charging greenskin dreadnoughts with satchel charges and welding torches. A crucial element of the defense was the support of the Legio Invigilata, the Emperor's Guard. The Titan Legion had walked in defense of Hellsreach, led by the Imperius Stormherald, an Imperator-class Titan that stood as a god of war amidst the spires. The presence of the Stormherald was the only thing keeping the massive Ork gargants at bay. The duels between the Imperial Titans and the Ork god machines shook the foundations of the hive. Plasma destructors vaporized entire city blocks to kill a single enemy engine. Yet, for every gargant that fell, the Orks scavenged the wreckage to build two more. The attrition rate was unsustainable. The perimeter shrank day by day, forcing the defenders back toward the high ground of the hive spire and the temple of the Emperor Ascendant. It was during the darkest hour of the siege, when the outer walls had been breached and the Stormherald was beset by a pack of Ork mega gargants, that the defenders played their final forbidden card. Deep beneath the foundations of Hellsreach, in a vault sealed since the days of the Great Crusade, lay a weapon of the Mechanicum that was less a machine and more a force of nature. This was the Ordinatus Armageddon, known by its machine name Oberon. Its existence was a secret known only to the highest-ranking tech priests of the planet, and its awakening required rituals that bordered on tech heresy due to the machine's belligerent and ancient spirit. Grimaldus, recognizing that the conventional war was lost, sanctioned the awakening of the beast. Tech priests and servitors, chanting binary canticles of awakening, flooded the reactor chambers of the Ordinatus with energy. Oberon was a Leviathan, a tracked vehicle the size of a small city, mounting a Nova cannon of such magnitude that it was typically mounted on the prows of capital ships. As the massive blast doors of the underground hangar ground open, the ground shook not from artillery, but from the tread of the Ordinatus. It emerged into the smog-choked daylight, its hull humming with the contained power of a dying star. The target was the Godbreaker, the largest of the Ork gargants, a mountain of rust and guns that had crippled the Stormherald and was preparing to level the Temple District. The firing of the Ordinatus Armageddon was a moment of silence in the cacophony of war. The Nova cannon discharged, stripping the atmosphere of ozone and blinding every sensor suite in the sector. The shell, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light, struck the Godbreaker center mass. There was no explosion in the traditional sense. The Ork machine simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a sphere of expanding plasma that incinerated the thousands of Orks marching in its shadow. The shockwave flattened the surrounding ruins, and the morale of the Ork army shattered. For the first time in months, the Greenskins faltered, terrified by the wrath of the Omegid. However, the deployment of Oberon was a temporary reprieve, not a salvation. The weapon's reactor cycled down, requiring hours to recharge, and the Ork horde was limitless. The enraged greenskins, driven by the WAAAGH energy, surged forward to destroy the weapon and the city that housed it. The defenders, their numbers reduced to a fraction of their original strength, fell back to the temple of the Emperor Ascendant. This vast basilica, a cathedral that had stood for millennia, was the spiritual heart of the city. It was here that Grimaldi declared the final stand would take place. The siege of the temple was a scene of apocalyptic fury. The Black Templars, now numbering fewer than 30 effectives, manned the barricades alongside the battered remnants of the Steel Legion and the surviving dock gangs. The Orks swarmed the steps of the basilica like a rising tide of filth. Bolters ran dry, and the Astartes fought with combat knives and chainswords. Grimaldi stood at the great doors, a reaper of souls, his armor battered and his cloak torn, reciting the litanies of hate as he smashed Ork skulls with his Crozius. Inside the temple, the apothecaries worked feverishly, not to save the lives of the fallen, but to harvest the gene seed of the dead brothers. The preservation of the chapter's future was the only victory left to achieve. The Orks, unable to breach the line of black-armored giants, brought down the building itself. Crude demolition charges and rocket fire hammered the ancient supports of the cathedral. The roof, a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, groaned and gave way. Tons of stone and plasteel rained down upon the combatants. The temple of the Emperor Ascendant collapsed, burying the defenders and the attackers alike in a tomb of dust and rubble. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the settling of debris. To the outside world and to High Marshal Helbrecht in orbit, it appeared that the crusade of Helsreach had ended in total annihilation. But the Astartes are hard to kill, and the Black Templars are harder still to keep down. Days later, as the Ork forces looted the ruins, the rubble shifted. From the grave of the cathedral, a gauntleted hand punched through the masonry. Reclusiarch Grimaldus pulled himself from the wreckage, his armor crushed, his systems failing, but his spirit unbroken. He was the sole survivor of the command cadre that had held the doors, having been shielded by the bodies of his fallen brothers and the architecture of the altar itself. He carried with him the harvested gene seed and the relics of the temple. When the relief forces finally broke through to the ruins of Helsreach, a counterattack spearheaded by the Salamanders and fresh regiments of the Steel Legion, they found Grimaldi standing amidst the wreckage of the basilica, surrounded by the corpses of hundreds of Orks he had slain before and after the collapse. He refused medical attention until the gene seed was secured. The city of Helsreach was gone, reduced to a husk, but the Orks had paid a price in blood that staggered even their brutal calculus. The population had been evacuated or died fighting, and the enemy had been denied the strategic port for months, disrupting their entire southern offensive. Grimaldus was hailed by the survivors and the citizens of Armageddon as the hero of Helsreach, a title he accepted with bitter stoicism. To him, he had failed to save the city, but he had succeeded in his duty to exact a toll from the enemy. The defense of Helsreach became a legend within the Black Templars chapter, a testament to the doctrine of no pity, no remorse, no fear. The survival of the gene seed ensured that the warriors who died on the steps of the Emperor's temple would live on in future generations of initiates. As Grimaldus rejoined the Eternal Crusader, he did not look back at the ruined city. His war was not over, the beast was still alive, and as long as a single Ork drew breath on Armageddon, the crusade would continue. The fires of Helsreach had merely tempered the Black Templars, sharpening them into a weapon ready to be plunged into the heart of the WAAAGH once more. While the blackened skeletons of hive cities like Helsreach and Hades stood as monuments to the ferocity of urban warfare, a different, more primal conflict was consuming the sweltering belt that separated the northern and southern continents. The equatorial jungle of Armageddon had always been a hostile scar on the planet's surface, a tangled, toxic nightmare of mutated flora and acidic swamps fed by the industrial runoff of 1,000 years. In the Third War, however, this region ceased to be merely a geographical barrier and transformed into a slaughterhouse where the technological advantages of the Imperium were suffocated by the canopy and the mud. It was here that the Adeptus Munitorum deployed the regiments best suited for hell, the Elysian drop troops, and the Catachan jungle fighters. The deployment of the Elysian drop troops, specifically the 23rd and 158th Regiments, was a tactical necessity born of the terrain's impassability. Heavy armor columns of the Steel Legion bogged down within kilometers of entering the tree line, their tracks churning uselessly in the sludge while Ork tankbustas ambushed them from the dense foliage. The Elysians, hailing from a world of floating cities and voids, bypassed the mire entirely. Their doctrine of vertical envelopment saw squadrons of Valkyrie and Vulture gunships screaming over the jungle canopy, their vector thrust engines kicking up storms of leaves and spores. They were tasked with seizing vital infrastructure, pumping stations, isolated bridges over the sludge rivers, and promethium relay nodes that the Orks were using to refuel their dreadnoughts. An Elysian assault was a marvel of synchronized aggression. Soldiers equipped with grav chutes dropped from the rear ramps of their transports, plummeting through the thick, tangled branches to land directly atop unsuspecting Ork encampments. They fought with a reliance on high-tech weaponry and mobility, utilizing bullpup lascarbines and compact grenade launchers designed for close-quarters clearance. Yet, the jungle took a heavy toll on their equipment. The humidity fouled grav chute impellers, and the acidic mist etched the lenses of their targeting arrays. The Elysians found themselves fighting a three-front war, against the Orks, against the gravity that threatened to dash them into the trees if a chute failed, and against the environment itself. They secured the high ground, establishing fire bases in the upper branches of the iron bark trees, raining fire down on the greenskins who lacked the discipline to look up until it was too late. In stark contrast to the aerial ballet of the Elysians, the Catachan jungle fighters fought the war in the mud, eye to eye with the beasts. For the soldiers of Catachan, the equatorial jungle of Armageddon was not a hellscape. It was a disappointing vacation compared to their death world home. Regiments like the Catachan 18th, led by the legendary Colonel Iron Hand Straken, did not try to tame the jungle or fly over it. They became part of its lethal ecosystem. They discarded the standard issue flak armor, which they deemed useless and noisy, preferring their red bandanas and sin skin vests. They moved through the undergrowth with a silence that unnerved even the feral instincts of the Orks, setting booby traps with monofilament wire and blind grenades that turned Ork patrols into bloody ruin without a single law's shot being fired. The war between the Catachans and the Orks in the jungle was visceral and barbaric. It was a conflict of heavy flamers and cold steel. The Catachans utilized Devil's Claw combat knives, blades long enough to be short swords, to hack through the vegetation and the thick hides of the greenskins. They understood that in the jungle, the loud crack of a bolter gave away a position, so they relied on ambushes and the terrifying effectiveness of their snipers, who would wait motionless in the sludge for days to put a needle round through the eye of an Ork knob. The Catachans also exploited the local fauna, luring Orks into the nesting grounds of carnivorous plants, or driving them into the path of migrating squigoths. This was not a war for territory in the traditional sense. It was a hunt, and the Catachans were apex predators, proving that humanity could be just as savage as the Xenos. While the jungle floor ran red with blood, a new and unexpected threat emerged from the murky depths of Armageddon's polluted oceans. The Tempest Ocean and the Dead Sea had largely been considered secure by Imperial High Command, viewed merely as natural barriers that restricted Ork movement. This assumption was shattered by the ingenuity of the Ork mechbas, driven by the manic genius of Orkheims. The Orks had salvaged the wreckage of downed void ships and gutted industrial haulers, welding them shut and fitting them with crude, noisy, but functional screw propellers and ballast tanks. They had built a fleet of submersibles. These underwater war machines were grotesque parodies of naval engineering. Leaking oil and venting exhaust directly into the water, they rumbled along the continental shelves, invisible to the auspex arrays that scanned the skies and the surface. The Orks navigated not by sonar, but by feeling the vibrations of the industrial churning from the hives above. The surprise was absolute when these rust-bucket leviathans surfaced in the rear echelon areas. They targeted the coastal water processing plants and the thermal cooling exchanges that regulated the temperatures of the hive reactors. At the port facilities of Hive Tempestora and the rig cities of the Boiling Sea, the water erupted in frothing white foam as the Ork submersibles breached. Bow ramps slammed down, disgorging mobs of soaking wet, roaring boys directly into the undefended logistical hubs. They struck at the water purification intakes, poisoning the supply for millions of civilians, and sabotaged the dockyards where the Imperial Navy docked its surface hydrofoils. The psychological impact was devastating. Nowhere was safe. The concept of a front line evaporated when a 1,000-ton submarine could surface inside a secure harbor and unleash a death dread. The Imperial Guard was forced to divert significant resources to guard the coastlines, stretching the already thin lines at the hive walls even further. The battles in the water treatment plants were particularly horrific, fought in the labyrinthine pipe networks and filtration pools, where the water turned black with orc blood and promethium. Amidst this chaos of open warfare, a shadow war was being prosecuted by one of the most notorious units in the Imperial Guard, the 13th Penal Legion, better known as the Last Chancers. Led by the implacable Colonel Schiefer, a man whose devotion to the Emperor was matched only by his disregard for the lives of his charges, the Last Chancers were a collection of thieves, murderers, and traitors who had been offered a simple bargain: die fighting for the Emperor, or die by the firing squad. Their mission on Armageddon was not to hold a line or take a hill, but to cut out a cancer that had been festering since the Second War. They were hunting Hermann von Straub, the traitorous former overlord, having escaped imperial justice and sold the secrets of the planetary defenses to Ghazghkull, was hiding deep within the Orc-controlled territories. Intelligence provided by captured Xenos and deep-range augurs pinpointed his location to a command bunker complex in the shadow of the Smoking Mountains, a region teeming with greenskins. Schiefer's plan was a suicide mission in the truest sense. The Last Chancers infiltrated the area disguised as local scavengers and utilizing captured Orc vehicles, relying on the chaotic nature of the Orc encampments to mask their presence. Among the penal troopers was the reluctant hero, Lieutenant Cage, a man whose survival instinct was almost supernatural. The team navigated the subterranean tunnels of the Orc camp, bypassing the pits where Gretchen slaves twalled and the arenas where knobs fought for dominance. They moved through the heart of the enemy army, planting explosives and sowing confusion. When they finally breached von Straub's sanctuary, they found a man consumed by his own delusions. Von Straub sat upon a throne of scrap, surrounded by Orc bodyguards he believed were his loyal subjects, convinced he was the true ruler of Armageddon and that the Orcs were merely his instrument to purge the usurpers. The confrontation was brief and brutal. The Last Chancers did not come to arrest von Straub. The time for trials had passed 50 years ago. A firefight erupted in the bunker, the penal legionnaires trading their lives to clear a path to the traitor. Von Straub's end was ignoble. He was not granted a duel or a final speech. As the bunker collapsed around them, triggered by the demolition charges set by Schiefer's team, the former overlord was abandoned by his Orc allies, who turned on him the moment he ceased to be amusing or useful. The details of the kill shot remain buried in the classified reports of the Officio Prefectus, but the result was undeniable. The traitor of Armageddon was dead, his body left to rot beneath the mountain of filth he had helped create. The mission decimated the 13th Penal Legion, leaving only Schiefer and a handful of survivors, including Cage, to extract from the blast zone, their debt to the Emperor paid in blood. Yet, even as traitors died and submersibles were depth-charged, a creeping, biological horror was solidifying the Orc hold on the planet in a way that no military victory could reverse. This was the threat of the spores. The biology of the Orc is a fungal symbiosis. When an Orc dies, it releases spores that settle into the soil, eventually growing into squigs, snotlings, and finally, new Orcs. In the dry ash wastes, the Imperial flamer crews could burn the corpses and scorch the earth to sterilize the ground. But in the equatorial jungle, the conditions were perfect for the greenskin reproductive cycle. The heat, the humidity, and the abundance of decaying organic matter acted as a hyper-accelerant for the Orc spores. A skirmish fought by the catachons in a sector of the jungle would result in hundreds of Orc corpses left in the undergrowth. Within days, the spores would take root. Within weeks, the fungal cocoons would be pulsing in the dark, loamy soil. The jungle was birthing armies. These were not the mechanized, armor-clad warriors of Ghazghkull's fleet. These were feral Orcs. Primitive, savage, and armed with stone axes and clubs fashioned from ironwood, They emerged from the foliage in the millions. This green tide was relentless. The Imperial forces found that they could not clear the jungle. They would secure a sector, burn it out, and move on, only to find that behind them, a new generation of orcs had spawned from the very soil they had fought over. The feral orcs attacked supply convoys and isolated outposts with a hunger that bordered on the demonic. They lacked the technology of their space-faring kin, but they possessed an instinctive knowledge of the jungle that rivaled even the catachons. They rode upon massive, tusked boars and hunted in packs. The realization dawned on the Imperial strategists with horrifying clarity. Armageddon was becoming an orc world. The biosphere itself was being rewritten. The native flora was being choked out by alien fungi brought by the invaders. The jungle was no longer just terrain, it was a factory producing the enemy. To cleanse the equatorial jungle would require burning the entire continent down to the bedrock, an act of ecological extermination that would render the planet uninhabitable and useless to the Imperium's industrial needs. The war in the jungle had become a trap, a grinding stalemate where the enemy replenished its numbers simply by dying. The catachons and Elysians were not fighting a finite army, they were fighting a biological inevitability, holding back a sea of green that rose higher with every drop of blood spilled into the mud. The biological horror unfolding in the equatorial jungles was merely a microcosm of the contagion that had infected the entire Armageddon subsector. While the catachons and Elysians fought a war of knives and grav shoots beneath the toxic canopy, the conflict expanded vertically, piercing the smog layer to turn the void surrounding the planet into a graveyard of ships. The initial orc assault had been a sledgehammer blow, a concentrated insertion of rocks and hulks, but as the war dragged into its second year, the engagement zone widened to encompass the surrounding systems. The gravitational well of Armageddon became a trap, drawing in combatants from across the segmentum solar, transforming the shipping lanes into a gauntlet of debris and ambush points. The Void War required a different breed of warrior than the trench fighters of the Steel Legion, and the Imperium responded by deploying chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, whose doctrines were forged in the cold vacuum and the high-speed maneuver. The White Scars, sons of the Great Khan, arrived not to man the walls of the hives, but to hunt in the darkness between the stars. Their strike cruisers, painted in white and red, moved with a predatory grace that shamed the lumbering vessels of the Imperial Navy. They engaged the Ork kill cruisers and terror ships that were attempting to run the blockade to deliver scrap and reinforcements to the surface. These engagements were not the broadside duels favored by the naval admittee. The White Scars utilized boarding torpedoes and Thunderhawk gunships to deliver lightning strikes directly to the engines and command decks of the Ork vessels. In the zero-gravity corridors of the greenskin ships, White Scars Terminators and Vanguard veterans fought battles of terrifying speed, their power weapons carving through the crude iron bulkheads and the massed ranks of Ork freebooters. They crippled the propulsion drives of the Ork ships, leaving them drifting and helpless, easy prey for the Nova cannons of the waiting Navy battleships. The White Scars did not linger to celebrate. They struck, severed the enemy's capability to move, and accelerated away before the Ork return fire could track them, embodying the storm that is their namesake. Simultaneously, the Space Wolves brought their own savage brand of warfare to the sector. The Sons of Russ had a blood debt to pay on Armageddon, a legacy of honor dating back to the First War and the defiance of Logan Grimnar against the Inquisition. This time, their enemy was Xenos, and their restraint was non-existent. Great Wolf Grimnar deployed his great companies as shock troops, hurling them into the most desperate void zones and surface engagements. In the debris fields orbiting the moon of St. Joan's Dock, the Space Wolves fleet engaged a massive cluster of Ork rocks that had failed to achieve planetary orbit. The Wolf Lords led boarding actions that turned the hollowed-out asteroids into slaughterhouses. The close quarters ferocity of the Space Wolves, wielding frost axes and bolters, cleared the rocks tunnel by tunnel. They did not utilize the surgical precision of the White Scars. They simply butchered every living thing aboard the asteroids and set melta charges on the reactors, turning the rocks into expanding clouds of plasma and dust. Despite this aggressive interdiction, the volume of Ork traffic remained overwhelming. For every ramship the White Scars gutted, two more slipped through the cordon. For every rock the space wolves shattered, another slammed into the ash wastes. The war had achieved a critical mass, where the destruction of assets no longer seemed to affect the enemy's capacity to fight. The Orks were scavenging the debris of their own destroyed fleets to build new ships in orbit, creating a self-sustaining cycle of scrap and violence. The Armageddon system was no longer just a battlefield. It was a churning industrial engine of war that consumed metal and flesh in equal measure. It was amidst this grinding stalemate that the architect of the apocalypse, Ghazghkull Thraka, experienced a revelation that would alter the trajectory of the war. The great beast sat within his command sanctum aboard the colossal space hulk Thraka, a vessel the size of a small moon, bristling with enough weaponry to level a continent. He watched the tactical hololiths displaying the endless carnage on the surface below. He saw the deadlock at the hives, the meat grinder in the jungles, and the burning skies. To any other Ork warlord, this was paradise, an eternal fight against the best warriors the Hummies could offer. But Ghazghkull was no longer just a warlord. He was a prophet of Gork and Mork, and the gods were whispering to him that his work here was done. Ghazghkull realized that Armageddon had served its purpose. He had broken the Imperial defenses, humiliated their commanders, and turned their most vital industrial world into a burning ruin. He had created a beacon that was drawing Orks from across the galaxy, uniting the fractured clans in a common cause. But to stay and oversee the grinding attrition was to stagnate. The vision granted to him by the green gods showed him a galaxy in flames, a great WAAAGH that would swallow the stars, not just a single system. To achieve this, he had to leave his masterpiece behind. He had to spread the infection. The departure of the beast was not a retreat, it was a breakout. In the closing months of the 999th year of the 41st millennium, the Thraka and a massive armada of escort vessels fired their main engines. The energy output was so immense it caused atmospheric disturbances on the planet below. The Ork fleet did not maneuver to engage the Imperial blockade, it simply accelerated directly at it. The sheer mass of the space hulk allowed it to plow through the Imperial cordon like a leviathan breaching the surface of the ocean. Void shields flared and collapsed, and Imperial frigates were crushed against the prow of the Ork flagship, or vaporized by the overwhelming volume of fire from its custom batteries. The sudden movement of the Ork flagship sent a shockwave through the Imperial High Command. Commissar Yarrick, monitoring the situation from the surface, understood instantly what was happening. The nightmare that had haunted him since the Second War was recurring. The beast was escaping to fight another day. Yarrick knew with a cold, crystalline certainty that if Ghazghkull was allowed to leave the system, he would return with a force that would threaten Terra itself. The Commissar contacted High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars, demanding a pursuit. Helbrecht, a warrior whose hatred for the Xenos was absolute, did not hesitate. He recognized that the head of the serpent was baring its neck. The Black Templars' flagship, the Eternal Crusader, broke orbit, rallying a crusade fleet of strike cruisers and fast attack vessels. Yarrick, refusing to be left behind on the surface, took a shuttle to the Eternal Crusader, joining the High Marshal on the bridge. The pursuit that followed was a saga of obsession and void-faring skill. The Imperial fleet chased the Thraka to the very edge of the system, trading broadsides with the Ork rearguard. The chase led them into the Haunted Gulf, a region of space plagued by warp storms and navigational hazards. The Thraka, piloted by the mad genius of Orkheims and the brute force of Ork navigators, plunged into the turbulence. Helbrecht and Yarrick followed, their ships battered by the gravimetric shears and the psychic backlash of the warp anomalies. The Black Templars launched boarding torpedoes and assault rams at the fleeing hulk, desperate to disable its warp drives. Space Marines fought across the hull of the Ork vessel in the vacuum of space, planting melta charges on the engine cowlings, but the Ork defense was fanatical. Ghazghkull had left behind his most loyal knobs to hold the corridors, sacrificing them to buy time for his translation into the warp. In a final, blinding flash of displacement energy, the Thraka tore a hole in reality and vanished into the immaterium, leaving the Eternal Crusader in its wake, its sensors blindly sweeping the void. The beast had escaped. The frustration on the bridge of the Black Templars' flagship was palpable. Yarrick stood silently, gripping the railing with his power claw, knowing that the galaxy had just become a significantly more dangerous place. The pursuit was not over. Helbrecht swore an oath of crusade to hunt Ghazghkull to the end of the universe, but for Armageddon, the immediate presence of the prophet was gone. However, on the surface of Armageddon, the departure of Ghazghkull did not signal the end of the war. Paradoxically, it made the conflict more chaotic and difficult to manage. While Ghazghkull had been present, there was a singular will directing the WAAAGH. Strategies were coordinated, objectives were selected with purpose, and the infighting was kept to a minimum by the fear of the warlord's wrath. With the prophet gone, the unifying field that held the Ork psyche together fractured. The WAAAGH did not dissipate, it splintered. The massive army that Ghazghkull had assembled broke apart into hundreds of warring warbands, each led by a warboss or a nob who saw themselves as the rightful heir to the command. The discipline that had characterized the initial invasion evaporated, replaced by the natural anarchic state of the Ork race. The strategic map of Armageddon dissolved into a patchwork of tribal fiefdoms. Goths fought evil Sunts for control of the highways, Bad Moons hoarded ammunition and refused to supply the front lines. Snakebites abandoned the sieges to hunt megafauna in the ash wastes. This fracture fundamentally changed the nature of the war for the Imperial defenders. They were no longer fighting a single, monolithic army that could be decapitated. They were fighting a hydra. An Imperial offensive might crush a warband of blood axes in the fire wastes, only to find that their flank was being raided by a mob of speed freaks who had no connection to the previous engagement. Intelligence gathering became a nightmare. There was no central command bunker to bomb, no single supply line to cut. The Orks became unpredictable, launching suicidal attacks for no strategic gain other than the desire for a good scrap or to loot a specific type of tank. The infighting among the Orks did provide some respite for the beleaguered hives, as greenskin columns often turned their guns on each other before reaching the Imperial lines. However, it also meant that the Orks were everywhere. They spread out like a virus, infesting the ruins, the wastes, and the mountains. They dug in, building shanty towns and scrap fortresses, establishing their own territories. The season of fire had ended, replaced by a permanent state of grinding, low-intensity warfare that bled the Imperium of resources and manpower every single day. The deadlock that descended upon Armageddon was absolute. The Imperium, despite the massive influx of reinforcements and the presence of the Titan legions, found itself unable to deliver the killing blow. The sheer number of Orks on the planet was estimated in the billions, a population that rivaled the human citizenry. The spores released by years of constant slaughter had taken root deep in the planetary crust. In the equatorial jungles, the feral Orks were breeding at a rate that outpaced the Imperial Guard's ability to kill them. To cleanse the planet would require exterminatus, the total destruction of the biosphere, but Armageddon was too valuable to destroy. The Adeptus Munitorum and the High Lords of Terra were forced to make a grim calculation. Armageddon produced the Chimeras and Leman Russ tanks that fueled the wars in the surrounding sectors. Losing it would cause a logistical collapse across the segmentum solar. Therefore, the planet had to be held, regardless of the cost. The war transformed from a campaign of liberation into a campaign of containment. The objective was no longer to exterminate every Ork, but to keep the production lines running while the war raged outside the factory gates. Armageddon became the ultimate training ground for the Imperial Guard. Regiments from across the galaxy were rotated into the war zone to be blooded. Freshly raised troops from calm worlds were thrown into the ash wastes to face the greenskins. Those who survived were hardened veterans, shipped out to other war zones as elite shock troops. Those who died were fed into the corpse starch recyclers to feed the next wave. The planet became a self-sustaining engine of death. The factories churned out tanks that were immediately driven to the front lines a few hundred kilometers away, destroyed, salvaged by the Adeptus Mechanicus, repaired, and sent back out. The stalemate was maintained by a colossal expenditure of human life. The wall of bodies doctrine remained in effect. Trench lines stretching for thousands of kilometers were dug across the ash wastes, manned by millions of guardsmen who lived and died in the gray mud. The artillery duels never ceased. The sky was permanently gray, choked by the dust of the rocks and the smoke of the manufactorums. The citizens of the hives lived in a state of perpetual siege, drilling gas mask protocols and bomb shelter drills as part of their daily existence. Even the Adeptus Astartes were forced to adapt to this new reality. They could not be everywhere, so they adopted a role of rapid reaction fire brigades. The salamanders maintained a permanent presence, their compassion for the people leading them to act as protectors of the convoys and the hab blocks. The Black Templars, though their High Marshal had left, kept crusade elements in the system to purge the most dangerous concentrations of orcs. The Space Wolves continued their hunts, treating the feral wilderness as a testing ground for their blood claws. The tragedy of the deadlock was that it was exactly what Ghazghkull had engineered. By leaving the planet in a state of total war, he had created a Valhalla for his people. The orcs on Armageddon were happy. They had endless enemies, endless scrap, and a world that was slowly turning into a reflection of their own brutal nature. The WAAAGH energy generated by the conflict acted as a beacon, drawing more freebooters and mercenary warbands to the system every year. The Imperium was trapped in a cycle of violence it could not break, forced to pour endless resources into a bottomless pit to save a world that was already half dead. As the 41st millennium drew to its close, Armageddon stood as a grim testament to the state of the galaxy. It was a world of ruin and ash, where the only constant was war. The heroic charges and grand strategies of the early years had given way to the drudgery of the kill count. The soldiers of the Steel Legion, their greatcoats stained with the dust of their homeworld, fought on with a grim fatalism, knowing that there would be no victory parade, only the next shift in the trenches. The Third War had not ended, it had simply become the way of life. The planet had become a forge not just of weapons, but of war itself, burning with a fire that threatened to consume the very stars that looked down upon it. The grinding stalemate that defined the closing years of the 41st millennium on Armageddon was not broken by a brilliant tactical maneuver or a new wave of Xenos reinforcements, but by the shattering of the galaxy itself. The fall of Cadia and the subsequent birth of the Great Rift, known to the Imperium as the Cicatrix Maledictum, sent a psychic shockwave screaming across the stars that ignored the boundaries of material space. On Armageddon, a world already drowning in the psychic resonance of billions of warring souls, the effects were immediate and catastrophic. The gray, smog-choked skies that had hung over the ash wastes for centuries did not merely darken, they bruised, turning a sickly, violaceous hue as the barrier between the materium and the immaterium thinned to the consistency of wet parchment. The first sign of the new horror was the silence. The Noctis Eterna, or the Days of Blinding, severed all astropathic communication with Terra and the wider Imperium. The guiding light of the Astronomicon flickered and died, leaving the navigators of the system blind and the defenders of the hives isolated in a way they had never experienced. For the soldiers of the Steel Legion, huddled in their trench lines along the Hemlock River, the silence was palpable. The Vox networks dissolved into static screams, and the sanctioned psychers attached to the command platoons began to convulse, their minds burned out by the sudden influx of raw warp energy. Discipline, usually the iron backbone of the Armageddon regiments, frayed as men looked up at the bleeding sky and felt a primal dread that had nothing to do with the orcs across the wire. The orcs, however, reacted with a frenzy of renewed violence. To the greenskin mind, the sudden turbulence of the warp was not a source of fear, but a stimulant. The Weirdbuys, the psychic channels of the WAAAGH, became conduits for energies they could barely control, their heads literally exploding with green lightning that arc over the battlefields, vaporizing friend and foe alike. The feral orcs in the equatorial jungles howled in unison, driven into a blood madness that stripped away what little tactical cunning they possessed, replacing it with pure suicidal aggression. But even the orcs were unprepared for what came next. The war for Armageddon was about to cease being a binary conflict between human and Xenos. It was about to become a three-way war for the very soul of the planet. As the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half, the reality of Armageddon buckled. The sheer volume of bloodshed over the last 50 years had thinned the veil, turning the entire planet into a ritual circle of unintentional design. In the heart of the ash wastes, where the dead lay piled in drifts 10 meters deep, the blood-soaked mud began to boil. The air filled with the stench of ozone and copper, overpowering the familiar smells of promethium and cordite. From the shadows of the ruined manufactorums and the craters of the no-man's land, the legions of the dark gods poured forth. The incursion was led by the forces of Khorne, the blood god. This was inevitable. Armageddon was a world dedicated to war, a planetary altar built of guns and skulls. The resonance of the conflict acted as a beacon to the demons of the Brass Citadel. Reality tore open like a wound, and bloodletters, their red skins slick with gore and their hellblades crackling with black energy, spilled into the trenches. They were followed by flesh hounds that outran the fastest orc buggies and juggernauts of Khorne that smashed through Leman Russ battle tanks as if they were made of tin. The war changed instantly. A Steel Legion platoon, preparing to repel an orc charge, suddenly found themselves fighting back to back with the Greenskins as a tide of demons crashed into the line. Simultaneously, the Changer of Ways, Tzeentch, found purchase in the despair and the labyrinthine politics of the Hive cities. In the upper spires of Hive and Furnace and the rebuilt districts of Tartarus, reality shifted. Corridors looped back on themselves, and the geometry of the Hab blocks became non-Euclidean. Flocks of screamers descended from the warp storms above, slashing through the anti-air batteries, while pink horrors capered through the streets, hurling bolts of mutagenic fire that turned hardened soldiers into piles of writhing protoplasm. The discipline of the Imperial Guard, designed to fight solid enemies with solid rounds, faltered against foes that split into two when killed and laughed as they burned. The strategic map of Armageddon dissolved into absolute anarchy. The coherent front lines that Yarrick and the High Command had maintained for years evaporated. The war became a chaotic melee where allegiance was dictated by survival. There were reports of orc warbosses directing their boys to shoot the spiky glowing things first, ignoring the Imperial tanks flanking them. In other sectors, the demons slaughtered both sides indiscriminately, building pyramids of skulls that reached toward the burning clouds. The orcs, true to their nature, found this new development to be the greatest thing that had ever happened. Fighting humans was good sport, but fighting demons, creatures that didn't die properly and provided a real challenge, was a gift from Gork and Mork. The invasion of chaos did not break the orc spirit, it invigorated it, drawing even more greenskins from the void who wanted to get stuck into the weird war. Amidst this apocalyptic confusion, a threat arose that eclipsed even the massed demonic incursions. In the center of the fire wastes, near the geologically unstable region known as the Nethuria Peninsula, the Khornate legions began to coalesce with a singular purpose. They were not just killing, they were preparing. The slaughter in this sector became industrialized, with demons herding captured populations of humans and orcs alike into massive ritual pits. The psychic scream of the dying was being channeled to weaken the barrier of reality further, specifically to create a gateway capable of sustaining an entity of godlike power. The minions of the Blood God were attempting to summon their greatest champion, the demon Primarch Angron. The Red Angel had walked upon Armageddon once before, 500 years prior, during the First War. His banishment had cost the lives of 100 Grey Knights and the sanity of the planetary population. Now, with the Great Rift yawning open above, the conditions for his return were perfect. If Angron were to manifest, the morale of the defenders would shatter, and the planet would be pulled irrevocably into the warp, becoming a demon world within the eye of terror's expansion. The threat was detected not by the blinded astropaths, but by the prognosticators of the Grey Knights, the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus. The secrecy that had shrouded their existence in the First War was no longer a luxury the Imperium could afford. The galaxy was burning, and the existence of demons was a truth written in blood across the sky. A strike force of Grey Knights, led by Brother Captain Kavan Lirak, translated directly from the warp into the atmosphere of Armageddon, their Silver Strike cruisers ignoring the orbital engagement zones to launch drop pods straight into the Khornate ritual site. They were not alone. The Salamanders chapter, who had maintained a permanent vigil over the world since the Second War, recognized the signs of the ritual. Chapter Master Tushin, remembering the legends of the First War, mobilized the Fire Drakes. The resulting battle on the Nethuria Peninsula was a clash of legends. The Grey Knights, clad in Aegis armor and wielding Nemesis Force halberds, smashed into the ranks of the Bloodletters with a holy luminance that burned the demonic flesh. They were the hammer, striking directly at the bloodthirsters leading the ritual. The Salamanders were the anvil, their flamers and melta-weapons forming a wall of fire that prevented the demonic reinforcements from overwhelming the smaller Grey Knight force. The fighting was desperate. The ritual was nearing completion. The sky above the peninsula had turned into a swirling vortex of blood, and the roar of the demon Primarch could be heard echoing from the other side of the veil, a sound that stopped the hearts of mortal men. The Grey Knights fought with a synchronized psychic might, chanting the rites of banishment as they carved a path to the central altar. It was a race against time. The Cornate demons fought with a frenzy that defied physics, but the disciplined fury of the Astartes held true. At the climax of the battle, the Grey Knights Justicars combined their psychic might to sever the tether anchoring the ritual to the material plane. With a scream of frustrated rage that shattered the glaciated obsidian of the wastes, the presence of Angron was shoved back into the warp. The vortex collapsed, sucking thousands of lesser demons back into the immaterium. The prevention of Angron's return was a victory, but it was a victory won in the middle of a burning house. The Great Rift remained, a scar across the night sky that would never heal. As the immediate demonic tide receded, banished by the closing of local rifts or destroyed by the relentless firepower of the unified armies, the status quo of Armageddon settled into a new, grim reality. The era Indomitus had arrived, and with it, the nature of the planet was fundamentally altered. In the 42nd millennium, Armageddon is no longer classified merely as a hive world or an industrial world. In the eyes of the High Lords of Terra and the Lord Commander Robute Guilliman, it has become a war world, a planetary engine of attrition that serves a vital strategic purpose. It is the anvil upon which the enemies of the Segmentum Solar are broken. The Imperium has accepted that Armageddon cannot be won in the traditional sense. To cleanse the planet would require resources that are desperately needed on 1,000 other fronts. Instead, the planet has been designated as the ultimate training ground for the Astra Militarum. Regiments from across the galaxy, fresh from their founding, are shipped to Armageddon not to achieve victory, but to be tempered. The logic of the Adeptus Munitorum is cold and irrefutable. If a regiment can survive 6 months in the ash wastes of Armageddon, fighting orcs and the lingering taint of chaos, they can survive anywhere. The planet has become a crucible. Cadian shock troopers, Valhallan ice warriors, and Kriegsmen are rotated through the meat grinder. Those who survive are extracted, hardened veterans who have seen the worst the galaxy can offer, and are redeployed to the Indomitus Crusade fleets. Those who die are simply added to the tally, their equipment salvaged for the next wave. For the orcs, Armageddon has become a holy site. The departure of Ghazghkull did not diminish the allure of the world, it enshrined it. The greenskins call it the Big Scrap. It is a pilgrimage destination. Orcs do not come to Armageddon to conquer it. They come because it is the only place in the galaxy where the fight never ends. The presence of the Great Rift and the occasional demonic incursion only adds to the appeal. Every orc boy knows that on Armageddon, the tanks are bigger, the explosions are louder, and the enemy never runs away. The planet acts as a magnet, drawing WAAAGH energy away from other sectors. In a twisted irony, the eternal war on Armageddon protects the wider Segmentum Solar by concentrating the orc threat in a single, contained kill zone. The geography of the world reflects this eternal conflict. The hives are no longer cities of commerce. They are fortress monasteries of industry, their populations entirely devoted to the support of the armies fighting outside their walls. The ash wastes are a graveyard of armor, where scavengers pick through layers of wreckage that date back centuries. The equatorial jungle remains a feral nightmare, a breeding ground that pulses with a green, malevolent life. The atmosphere is permanently toxic, requiring rebreathers for all non-Astartes personnel, a constant reminder that the planet itself is hostile to human life. The arrival of the Primaris Marines, brought by Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade, brought a brief flicker of hope, but even they were swallowed by the scale of the conflict. The new breed of Astartes, taller and stronger than their firstborn brothers, found themselves bogged down in the same mud that had claimed millions before them. They learned that on Armageddon, tactical superiority means nothing without the will to endure. The Steel Legion, initially skeptical of these new giants, came to respect them not for their gene-wrought strength, but for their willingness to stand in the radioactive dust and hold the line alongside the mortal soldiery. The secret history of the world, its origins as Ulanar, the throne world of the beast, remains buried, known only to a select few in the Inquisition and the Astartes leadership. Yet the echo of that ancient past vibrates through the souls of every boot that marches on the surface. The orcs feel it instinctively, a racial memory that tells them this is their world, stolen by the runty humans. The humans feel it as a crushing weight, a sense that the ground itself wants them dead. As the 41st millennium fades into history and the uncertain darkness of the 42nd unfolds, Armageddon stands as a monument to the state of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It is a world where peace is a forgotten concept, where victory is impossible, and where the only metric of success is survival for one more day. The heroes of the past, Yarrick, Grimaldus, Tushan, have become myths, their names invoked in prayers by soldiers who were born in the trenches and will die in the trenches. The wars for Armageddon are not over. They have simply coalesced into the war. It is a conflict without beginning or end, a fire that burns in the heart of the segmentum solar, fueled by the blood of billions. It is the eternal battlefield, the proving ground of the Imperium and the playground of the beast. As long as the orcs crave battle, and as long as the Imperium refuses to yield a single inch of his domain, Armageddon will burn. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and nowhere is that truth more absolute, more terrifying, and more glorious than on the world of Armageddon.